This happened in the early 90s when I was a junior in high school and was home on Christmas break. It was in the middle of a weekday and I was home alone when the phone rang. When I answered, a man asked for me by my first and last name. He then said, "This is Randy." Whatever else he was saying was unintelligible, but the last part he said was, "company," and I was calling too. I tried to interrupt to have him repeat his name and company again. He said it very quickly and unclearly, but he ignored my question and asked if I had been looking for a job. I wasn't, but I was young and sort of wanted to see what the job was going to be, so I hedged a bit. Randy then told me that he was hiring models for commercials and that someone had given him my name. I laughed because number one, that sounded completely fake, and number two, I wasn't exactly swimming in model contracts. When I told him that I believed he must be mistaken, he replied, "No, I think you're very pretty, Tessa." While that comment may not seem that disturbing, it stopped me in my tracks. He had initially said that I'd been recommended to him, but now he was speaking as if he had seen me. At that moment, I just knew in my gut that something was very wrong. Unfortunately, I had not yet learned to get my brain and my gut on the same page, so while I wasn't buying any of what he was selling, in order to be polite, and maybe, just in case there was some cash and an ego boost to be had, I said, "Okay, how about you just give me your number and I'll talk to my parents and get back to you." I knew if he was legit, he'd have no problem giving me his number. Also, my brother had been asked to do a commercial or a print ad or something a few years before. I knew that my parents had to sign some forms because he was underage, but of course, Randy failed both of my tests. He resisted giving me his number or allowing me time to talk to my parents. He encouraged me just to agree right then. So I promptly said, "No thank you," and I hung up. Within seconds of hanging up, the phone rang again. When I answered, I'll never forget what he asked me. He started asking me about different sexual acts. That escalated quickly as I stood stunned in silence. He repeated a question and then moved on to similar ones. What made it unnerving, besides the obvious, was that it didn't sound like a prank call at all. Even though his comments were sexual, he sounded almost angry. I was safe in my home and it was just a phone call, but it made me feel like I was in danger. I hung up, of course, but he called continuously, so continuously in fact, that every time I tried to pick up the phone to call my mom, he would either be on the line when I picked up the phone, or the phone would begin ringing again. By this point, I wasn't answering the phone, and if he was on the line when I picked up, I would hang up quickly, but he was getting angrier and angrier. His comments were taking a darker turn. What started as asking me invasive sexual questions had turned into comments about how he'd like to harm me. I was finally able to get through to my mom, and she called the police. They didn't seem to take it really seriously, or even act like they could do much. I didn't recognize his voice, and it wasn't a teenager. It was obviously a grown man. They felt that it was just someone messing with me, and it would just fade out on its own. And for a time, I guess, it seemed like they were right. That first day, he called constantly for a few more hours, but then the call stopped, and although it was very disturbing, it seemed to be over. Some time passed and I quit thinking about it, but then spring break rolled around. It was the same scenario as before. I was home from school on a weekday and I was alone. The phone rang, and when I answered, he launched straight into the vile sexual talk. I hung up and we began the same cycle as before, with him calling constantly and me trying to time it just right so I could pick up the phone between calls and call my mom. Every time I hung up on him, he got angrier and the things he said became more foul. This time, he started reciting my address and talking about paying me a visit. Not only did it feel very threatening, but it was so confusing. Who in the world was doing this? Why would a grown man I didn't know make these calls? Not just once, but 2 times months apart. How did he have so much information about me? None of it made any sense. When I was finally able to call my mom, she called the police again. The officer took it a bit more seriously. They asked if we wanted to put a tap on the phone. We agreed. They told us that the process is as follows. It would take 24 hours to get with the phone company and get it active. Once active, it would be there for 60 days. If there were no issues in 60 days, it would be removed. But if there were an issue, then we'd have him. Just like before, the calls continued throughout the afternoon, but they had stopped by the time my parents got home. I got some the next morning after my parents had left for work, but by the time the 24 window had passed, they had stopped, and once again, things were quieter for another few months. This cycle continued over the course of the next year. It was quiet until midsummer, then again until Christmas break of my senior year, and when he called, the pattern was almost always the same. The calls usually started out with him being more polite, but as soon as I recognized his voice and hung up, they became progressively more angry and violent. They always came when I was alone and began continuing the exact moment that my mom or dad pulled into the driveway. We would put the tap back on the phone each time, but the calls never continued for more than 24 hours in a stretch, and there was always at least 60 days in between episodes. The content of the calls, however, got increasingly more personal. He would regularly mention my address and eventually began talking about my clothing. But then he started mentioning things that I owned but didn't actually wear. This obviously took our level of fear up a notch. By this point, because he would call right up until someone else got home, we knew he had to be in a position to see our driveway. But every day after school, I would let myself in the side door using a key that was hidden outside. It was extremely well hidden, and you'd have to be positioned in just the right spot to ever get to see me use it. But if you were hiding and watching, then it was possible. It became impossible not to think he may have been in our house, in my room, and that thought was simply unbearable. We obviously stopped leaving a key outside, but the very nature of the cycle, short bursts of intense contact, followed by months of nothing, made it hard to know what to do. He clearly knew how to avoid the trace. He was motivated enough to keep contacting me over such a long period of time, and he was controlled enough to wait for long stretches in between calls. I had never been someone who scared easily, and my dad didn't want me to lose that. He started keeping the guns in the house loaded and taking me to the shooting range. After Christmas, a quiet few months passed as always. I had stayed alert for a week or two, and then I quit thinking about it. On the first day of my summer break, I was home and in a great mood when the phone rang. Expecting a call from my best friend, I said, "Hello?" And I heard, "I'm calling about the job you applied for. This is Randy," followed by more unintelligible words. I actually had been applying for jobs, but as I said to the man, "From where?" it hit me that this was the exact conversation we had the first time he called. I hung up and prepared myself for another awful day. The calls kept coming and, as usual, in the process of trying to call my mom, I would end up on the phone with him. The things he would say got worse after every quiet spell, and by this time, he was describing how he was going to murder me. More than the things he was saying, the rage in his voice triggered a real fear in me. I was having trouble getting the line open long enough to call my mom. I knew he was watching close enough to be watching the house. I got the gun out of the closet, and I sat there by the ringing phone. I was wanting to call my mom, but I wasn't wanting the chance to hear his voice again. I wasn't panicky, but I was crying and definitely scared. And then I was done. Just simply done. I picked up the phone and he launched into his sick spiel, trying to get as much in as he could before I hung up again. But I didn't hang up. I'm not sure why. I didn't have a plan, but I sat there silent for a few minutes and let him talk. And when he said that he could be at my house in less than 2 minutes, without thinking about it for a second, I said, "Come on over, the door's open." I then hung up the phone, walked over and unlocked and opened the front door, leaving just the screen door closed. With my gun in my hands, I sat down on the couch facing the door and waited. He never came, and he never called again. There is zero doubt in my mind that if he had walked onto that porch, I would have shot him, without hesitation. I still have no idea who it was, or why, or whether it would have escalated beyond phone calls. I went off to college, and my parents eventually moved out of that house, so I suppose it will forever be a mystery. I trust that God will give him what he deserves, but I definitely learned that people who feed off your fear disappear quickly when you quit being afraid.
If you really like my content and want to support me, please like this video and click the subscribe button. It helps me to grow my channel and is essential in reaching a wider audience. Most of you watching my videos aren't subscribed to my channel, and that's why my animations can't reach their full potential. They aren't recommended to more people who would surely love my content as much as you do. You can always unsubscribe at any moment. Thank you in advance, and enjoy the rest of the video.
About 10 years ago, when I was 12 years old, my family took a trip out east to visit some other family that lived out there. My aunt and uncle offered us to stay at their place because it was decently big and it was just the two of them living there after all of their kids had moved out. It was an old house in a nice little neighborhood, and it had a woods in the backyard. After we arrived there were 2 empty bedrooms. My parents got the larger one and I took the smaller one. I remember we walked around the city the first day and met up with some other family. Then we went back to their house. The next night, my parents, aunt, and uncle were all invited with a few people to dinner. When I realized I would be the only kid at the dinner, they told me I could stay home for the few hours. I was happy with this because I would rather play on my Xbox than be bored with a bunch of adults. There was a TV in my room, which was a pretty nice one, and after they left, I started playing Call of Duty. About 20 minutes in, I heard a car door shut, which sounded like it was coming from the driveway. I went over and looked out my second-floor window down to the driveway. The sun was setting, so it was kind of hard to see, but I saw a car parked on the side of the street between my aunt and uncle's house and the neighbors next door. A man had gotten out of the car and started walking up the driveway. I didn't recognize him, but I figured he was some sort of door-to-door salesman. I was definitely not going to answer the door, but I continued to watch him, all the way until he arrived at the front door. But when the man got to the front door, he didn't knock. He appeared to just look inside, and then walked around the side of the house towards the back. Suddenly, I got a bad feeling. Why would this man want to go into the backyard? The only details I could really make out about him is that he was wearing a black jacket and jeans with a camouflage baseball cap. I went out of the room and into the bathroom across the hall, which had a little window in it overlooking the backyard. I looked around for the man, and then I saw him. He was walking fairly close to the house and went to the back door. I saw him look inside of it and then appear to try the handle. To my surprise, I saw the door open and the man walk right inside. I think I went into shock for a couple of seconds when I saw this, because I really didn't think the door would be left unlocked. I heard noise coming from downstairs, the sound of the man coming inside. I didn't have a cell phone at the time, and the only house phone I knew of was downstairs. So I ran back into my bedroom and hid under my bed. I hoped the man wouldn't come upstairs and would just leave. I could sort of hear noises from downstairs of the man moving around. He seemed to be walking around near the kitchen and the living room. Then I heard him start to walk up the stairs. This scared me more than anything. He got up the stairs and walked down the hall. I heard him open a door nearby and then the door next to my room. Finally, my door got opened. I held my breath as it did, but as quickly as it opened, it was shut. I didn't know if the man was inside my room or outside because I was facing the wall, until finally I heard the door to my uncle's bedroom open. The man appeared to stay in there for a while and then walked back down the hallway and downstairs again. I kept hiding under the bed and hoped he wouldn't come back upstairs. I was feeling slightly relieved until I heard the footsteps come back up the stairs once again. They seemingly stopped directly in front of the bedroom door that I was in. Then came one of the scariest moments of my life. I heard the man on the other side of the door say, "I know you're in there and under the bed." Then the man told me to come out in a very creepy way. I didn't move, however, probably because I was frozen with fear. I was thinking of what I could possibly do when I heard a voice come from downstairs. It was the voice of another man, and he was yelling. I heard him say, "Hey," and "What's going on?" I heard the man upstairs, then walk back down to the base of the stairs and down them. I stayed in hiding. I heard some yelling come from downstairs, and then heard the voice of the second man yell he had called the police. About 10 minutes later of me shaking under the bed, I heard sirens and the police entered the house. I came out and talked to a lady police officer about what happened. The man that had broken in had left, but the other man had stayed. He turned out to be the next door neighbor. My parents arrived about 20 minutes later. I was told that the next door neighbor had seen the suspicious man enter the house and went inside to investigate. When he saw that the man had broken in, he yelled at him. The man that had broken into the house used to work for my uncle and had been fired about a year earlier. It was truly a miracle that the neighbor came in the house when he did, because he possibly saved my life.
Me and my wife have been listening to your channel since last year, and we think we might have a story that would fit well with your channel. It's been a few years since we moved out of our starter home, but back when we first moved in, we had this real nice elderly widower for a neighbor. He was retired and mostly spent his time in his backyard tending to the flower beds his wife had left behind. We had a lovely view of it from our bedroom, and most days you'd be able to see him out there, preening and nourishing the plants and generally being the most wholesome person ever. But then this one day, my husband called me upstairs and I found him staring out of the window over at our neighbor's backyard. I asked him what he was looking at and he just pointed in silent confusion, so I walk over towards the window to take a look for myself. Our neighbor was standing right in the middle of this big, perfectly trimmed lawn, and he was just slamming a shovel into the grass over and over again, obviously intent on digging a pretty big hole. It was weird, but after some discussion, we decided that there was obviously some kind of method to his madness, so to speak. He was probably planning on installing a bird feeder or something else that would require digging a hole into the lawn. The next day, my husband calls me upstairs again. Only this time, he had this weird urgency in his voice. I go upstairs, figuring it had something to do with the neighbor's lawn, and when I look out of the window, I see something that sends a chill right through me. The hole that our neighbor was digging was considerably larger now, and it wasn't some round pit fit for a bird bath or squirrel feeder or something. It was quite clearly a grave. You might be wondering how we knew that, how we could tell the difference between a grave and just any other kind of pit or trench that might have some perfectly normal purpose of function. But the big clue was the wooden cross our neighbor had stacked on the ground at one end. Almost immediately, my husband goes over to check if he's okay, and I had to wait like 5 or 10 minutes for him to come back. The moment he walks through the door, I ask him what was said, and he just sat down on the couch and began shaking his head, telling me he didn't know. I was so frustrated. I mean, how does he go over and just not ask about the grave that had been dug in the backyard? but my husband said that he didn't want to clue him into the fact that we'd basically been spying on him, and said that when push came to shove, he got really creeped out and just couldn't bring himself to ask. He said there was something different about our nice, friendly neighbor, that he didn't seem so nice and friendly anymore. He was normally all smiles and handshakes, full of small talk and compliments and the like. But that time he knocked on his door, my husband said that there was like a darkness about him, and it left him really, really unsettled. He reassured me by saying that we'd keep an eye on the whole thing, and if we suddenly saw him dragging a body into the grave or whatever, we'd just call the cops. This was on a Saturday morning, and the rest of the weekend my husband basically camped out in our bedroom, watching our neighbor's backyard for anything suspicious. It was a Sunday afternoon when he called me up into the bedroom again, and that time, we could see that our neighbor was quite clearly digging a second hole. You have to understand what a weird position this put us in. I mean, it's not illegal to dig holes in your backyard, and it wasn't like he'd taken the time to fill the first one. But if he really was planning on doing something hideous, we couldn't be the people to say that we watched him prepare for it and didn't do anything about it. In the end, I convinced my husband to call the cops, saying it was either him or me, so he called. I watched him make the call, and I watched him tell whoever was on the other end that he was concerned at our neighbor's behavior because he was clearly digging graves in his backyard. Like I said, he'd obviously yet to put anything inside of them. At least we hadn't seen him put anything inside of them, but his behavior was obviously very, very creepy, so we thought we'd run it by the cops to see what they had to say. My husband is all like, yeah, okay, thanks for a few minutes. And when he hangs up, he tells me that they're sending a patrol car over so some cops could ask him a few questions. We didn't want to make it obvious that it was us that had called them, but we still wanted to know what our neighbor had to say about the whole thing. So when we saw the cops pulling up outside his house, we went down into our garage and listened in. One of the walls of our garage was maybe only a few feet away from our neighbor's front door, and if you opened up one of the windows, you could hear almost everything that was being said. So we do just that, and we listen as the cops tell the guy that they had a complaint about some strange behavior, and if they could head inside of our neighbor's house to take a look around. I don't even know what we were expecting here, but it definitely wasn't a really defiant sounding, "You guys got a warrant," coming from our normally friendly neighbor. We figured the cops might have one, but turns out we didn't know squat about the law and that it takes way longer to get one than just a simple phone call from some concerned neighbors. The cops ended up leaving, but as soon as they did, we basically ran back upstairs to see if our neighbor was going to do anything like remove the wooden cross, fill the graves in, or if he'd just carry on digging the second one out as if he wasn't bothered by the cops having knocked on his door. My husband was the first one to the window, but as soon as he looks out, he turns around again, white as a sheet, and says, "He's looking at us." I couldn't resist. I know I should have just taken my husband's word for it and shouldn't have looked, but I just couldn't help myself. He was right. The guy was standing in his backyard right next to the graves, and he was looking up at our window with this angry look on his face. I tried to act as naturally as possible, feigning ignorance to the whole thing, so I just gave him a smile and a wave, then shut the curtains to make it look like we weren't staring. But I did make sure to leave a slight crack at the edge so we could peek out and keep an eye on the whole grave situation, because by that point, it had basically become our complete obsession. The next day, when we woke up for work, not only was there another wooden cross staked into the ground at the head of the second finished grave, but our neighbor was working on a third one. Then, by the time me and husband returned home from our respective jobs, our neighbor was working on a fourth. We couldn't keep our mind off how the whole thing was going to end, and the worst thing was when we got into our heads that the guy was planning on filling the third and fourth graves with us, since he'd somehow evidently gotten a pretty good idea of who had called the cops on him. We called the cops again that evening and told them that we were seriously worried about what our neighbor was up to. And when our call was forwarded to the relevant officer, we were assured that they were in the process of getting a search warrant and that they'd revisit the guy's house the moment that it was signed by a judge. The thing was, we just didn't think that we could wait that long, and I know for a fact that some pretty awful things have happened while people have been waiting for a search warrant to be signed. It was my husband that suggested the cops get in touch with a relative of our neighbor, if they had any on record, and ask them to knock on his door to check on them before it was too late. Thankfully, we think that's exactly what happened because after about a week of complete inactivity from our neighbor, my husband managed to catch a younger-looking person walking up to the guy's house with a set of keys in her hand. He asked if she knew anything about the guy who lived there, and she said yes, that it was her father's place, and he'd not been feeling too well recently, so he'd gone to stay with them for a while. She was just there picking up some of his clothes and stuff to take back to her place. We don't think she knew the extent of our knowledge of the situation, but my husband said she looked tired, really tired, so I figured whatever she knew about her father's state of mind had really taken it out of her. About a month later, there was a for sale sign up on the front lawn, and a full moving crew had showed up outside, boxing up the old guy's things before loading them into the back of the van. Then, a few days later, a landscaping crew came by and started filling in and patching over the graves. Let me tell you, they looked just as creeped out as we were. After that, we didn't hear anything else about it, and I understand why my husband didn't want to press the young woman for answers, since it already seemed like she was at a breaking point. Some people say it must have been kind of sad seeing an older guy losing his mind like that, but I'm not sure he was losing his mind, not in the way that people think. He seemed lucid as could be when he was talking to the cops. The way he just figured out who called them, or at least took a really good guess. That doesn't suggest a failing mind to me. All in all, it made for one of the creepiest, most unsettling experiences of my entire life, one I'll certainly never forget, and I'll always wonder, what were his intentions for those graves?
If you really like my content and want to support me, please like this video and click the subscribe button. It helps me to grow my channel as essential in reaching a wider audience. Most of you watching my videos aren't subscribed to my channel, and that's why my animations can't reach their full potential. They aren't recommended to more people who would surely love my content as much as you do. You can always unsubscribe at any moment. Thank you in advance, and enjoy the rest of the video.
We used to have this neighbor back when I was 15, and I didn't find this out until years later, but he basically was the sole reason we ended up moving out of the house we were living in at the time. So the way my dad tells it, it all started when the guy started making something in the shed in his backyard. Obviously, he was entitled to do whatever he wanted on his property, especially during the daylight hours, but my dad said all the sawing and hammering noises were a real pain in the butt. He figured it'd only be a couple of days, but a week went by and the guy was still making all this noise in the evenings and on weekends. It went on late into the night on a bunch of different occasions, and my dad had to go over and threaten to call the cops to get him to knock it off. Seems a little extreme, I know, but Dad had already tried asking nicely, and the guy was just a total jerk, so it was the only thing that seemed to work. After that, the guy kept the sawing and hammering to reasonable hours, still a pain apparently, but nothing he didn't have the right to. But then, my dad looks over the fence one day and sees the guy carrying a whole bunch of chains into the shed. Then the next thing he knows, the guy is carrying all these shackle-looking things into the shed, the kind you use to keep a person prisoner. Dad asks what he's building in there, but the guy is all, "Mind your business, mister," saying things like that. My dad is starting to get pretty nervous about the whole thing, and he's close to calling the cops because it was obviously looking incredibly shady, and maybe it'll get the guy to stop hammering and sawing all freaking day too. But still, he holds off for one night too long, and that's when he hears a scream coming from the guy's backyard. He says it was one of those screams of the blood-curdling variety, and he goes outside to listen, then hears a few more muffled sounds coming from the shed where the guy was building, whatever it was he was building in there. He tries looking over the fence to get an idea of what's going on and sees our neighbor walking out to the shed, covered in blood, with something sharp and shiny in his hand. But just before he closes the door, Dad said he caught a glimpse of someone strapped onto some kind of big wooden board. That was it. My dad runs back inside, calls the cops, and tells them something messed up is happening in our neighbor's backyard, how he has been building some kind of torture device or whatever, and how he thought he was in the process of basically murdering someone in there. The cops show up, but they don't make it into the backyard. They just drive off after talking to the guy. My dad calls the cops back and asks them what they're thinking, and they need to get into that shed right away because something unspeakable is happening in there. They tell them that they can't get into the guy's place without a warrant, that the guy had a bandaged hand and claimed the blood was because he had an accident. The cops seemed happy enough with that explanation and had gone back to their precinct. But they were in the process of getting a warrant because of my dad's claim that he'd seen a body in there, and because of how urgent it was, it might only be a few hours before they could get one signed by a judge. Then boom. The next day, the cops show back up at the guy's house at like 6 a.m., and it wakes my dad up because they were literally sawing a lock off the door to the shed. He watches all freaking morning, and get this, they carry out the body he'd seen in that shed. Only it wasn't a body. It was like one of those mannequin type things, and it had blood all over it. The guy has actually been building some kind of torture table in his shed, only he hadn't actually done anything to anyone, so the guy ended up getting a full apology from the county after they didn't find anything to arrest him over. But still, my dad's not happy knowing he lives next to someone who'd build something like that, and after arguing back and forth with the cops about the guy's right to build some sort of weird torture table, he ends up just being like, "Screw this, we're moving." He didn't say anything to us at the time because obviously me and my sister were still young and he didn't want anything like that in our heads. But after I had moved out and my sister had graduated college, he ended up telling us at a little reunion dinner. As you can guess, our jaws were on the floor when he was telling us, as we had no idea he was anything but some annoying home improvements nerd. It came up because we were complaining about having to move schools at that age, as me and my sister both lost a bunch of good friends and it sucked having to start at a new school right when I just started at a new one there. He figured the whole thing would be justified to us why we had to move, and honestly, I get it. I wouldn't want to live next to a freak like that, either.
Several years ago, we bought a house with a little creek running through the backyard. Who wouldn't want a house in such a tranquil setting? On the third day we owned our new home, our next-door neighbor came over and introduced herself. "Hi, my name is Ima Nasol." She greeted us cheerfully. We had an odd conversation, and when she left, hubby and I looked at each other and asked, what was that all about? That afternoon, I joked to hubby, "I can't believe I just moved next door to someone with plastic flowers in her yard." The next morning we got up, all the plastic flowers were gone. It was a Twilight Zone moment. Whether I was gardening in the backyard or front yard, Ima was soon outside striking up a conversation. She had a way of making statements that catch you off guard and beg for a reply. She managed to get a lot of personal information from me before I figured out what she was doing. Ima had several dogs, and their barking was a nuisance. Every night, no matter what time we went to bed, the dogs would start barking under our bedroom window within a minute of turning the lights out. It took us months to figure out that she was watching for our lights to go out. How creepy is that? I politely asked her to keep her dogs away from our bedroom window late at night. She put a huge grin on her face and said, "Nope, can't do that." Then the barking got worse and worse, and she stepped up the harassment several notches. I would either be polite or just put down my gardening tools and go in the house. Even though I never saw her watching me, she had ways of letting me know that she saw everything I did. I felt like I was being stalked She never bothered my husband, and my husband didn't believe me when I told him the things she was doing and saying to me. One day, I took hubby's car somewhere, and Emma assumed I was home alone. She started in with the harassment and creepiness. When I got home, hubby was shaken. He never doubted me after that. We had a nice neighbor on the other side of us, and one day, I asked her if she ever had any problems with Emma. She unloaded stories of years of abuse. Oh swell, what have we gotten ourselves into? We finally contacted animal control and filed a complaint about the dog's barking. They asked us to keep a record of when the dog started and stopped barking. The result? They barked between 60 to 70 hours per week. After a couple of weeks, I couldn't waste any more time keeping track. Emma was not happy about the dog complaint. Her next move was to call 911 the night of February 13th. At 11:45 p.m., 2 police cruisers and 4 cops showed up at our door for a domestic violence call, courtesy of Emma. Happy Valentine's Day. Every few months, Emma would get the urge to call 911 and report me for harassing her, even though by this time, I no longer spoke to her and went inside whenever she came outside. What we didn't know then was that Emma had a wheelchair, and after she called 911, she'd get in it before the police showed up. She'd tell the cop the sob story that she was a poor, old handicapped senior citizen being brutally harassed by me. I'm 2 years younger than Emma. Yeah, I'm a senior citizen too. Then the cop would come over to our house to ream me out for being such a horrible neighbor. Since my hair isn't gray, thanks to my hairdresser, I look much younger than Emma. So the cop assumed she's much older and more vulnerable. After several episodes of this, we installed covert video cameras. 2 months after getting the cameras, Emma had a hankering for the company of a uniformed officer. After hearing her sob story, he came to our house and told us to move away and stop harassing all the neighbors. To his credit, he agreed to view the video footage. The viewing left him speechless. Not only was there no wheelchair in sight, but everything she told him that I said or did to her, she had actually said and done to me. Shortly before we got the cameras, Emma tried to run me down with her car when I was out for a walk. When a friend of hers tried the same trick, we got it on camera. I didn't have to call 911 when that happened, because Emma called 911 first, with a pack of lies. The officer that responded refused to look at the video footage. Oh well. From time to time, Emma parked a car in front of our house and just sat there and watched us. She'd take photos and videos of us inside our house. She only did that once, after we got the cameras. They are covert, only to a point. If you zoom a camera in on them, you'll see them. She toned down her act after that. Things were quiet for almost a year. Then one night, we heard a loud boom, and the house shook. We peeked out the bedroom window and saw a couple of cars in front of Emma's house and a few people milling around her front yard. We got up and looked at the video footage and saw Emma's son light something and throw it at our house, toward our bedroom. Then the explosion that shook the house. We called the police, but since there were no injuries or damage to the house, only burned up plants in the yard, they wouldn't even file a report. A few days later, we met with a realtor. Psycho neighbor, let's not ever meet again. For a bit of context, I grew up in the middle of a farmland, in a large 1800s Victorian home. Given its history, there has always been several shacks and barns that once belonged to the builder of this house. There is a highway that sees maybe 3 cars on it during the night, and directly across from said highway, about 200 feet inward of a cornfield, is a shack that I have always found creepy. As kids, myself and friends would dare each other to go inside and look, which always ended up with us going as a team. Nothing scary was ever found. Maybe a few broken glasses, metal piles, and miscellaneous items. There was no electricity or any sort of utility that made it homely. Years go by, and the existence of the shack becomes a part of my daily life. However, one particular night, as I was watching TV, I noticed a light going off and on outside of my window. After getting startled, I dismissed it as passing cars, simply more frequent than they typically are. An hour passes. It's nearing midnight, and the light stays on. This time I know for sure it's coming from outside. My family was asleep, but being my pansy 16-year-old self, I needed confirmation. Too bad for me. No one wants to go check it out, so I go alone. I grab my pocket knife and a flashlight, the best I could think of with my shaken thoughts, and take off into the night. As I neared the highway, the light turns off, almost making me choke on air. But I had to figure out what the hell was going on. I make it to the entrance of the shack, which has no door, and slowly begin to enter, my flashlight scanning the room for any sign of life. What happened next, I'll never forget. 5 feet away from me, there's an old tattered recliner, facing away, that my father had tossed in there for future disposal. I shined my light on it, because I knew I'd seen it rock ever so slightly. As I did that, a man stands up from the recliner, saying absolutely nothing. All I could tell was that he was middle-aged and wearing a jacket of sorts. Before I could process what was happening, I was already sprinting across the road and praying he wasn't behind me. It felt like years before I could make it to my door. But as I'm about to make it into safety, I decide to look back. He was standing in the road, completely still. No words whatsoever. It's been 7 years since then. The shack still stands. The recliner remains in place. My dad never believed me. I wish someone could share the dread I had when I realized the recliner was facing a window which was directed straight at my house. Let's not meet again. This all started around December. I'm not sure if I should be contacting the police or anything, but it's quite unnerving. So I stay at my girlfriend's house on the weekends, and she lives on campus at a university. She lives with 2 of her roommates, and lives next door to her friends. This one night, I woke up to screaming at 2 a.m. Now, typically, you'd expect to be hearing screaming on campus from people leaving bars late at night. However, this was very different. There was a blood-curdling scream from a girl yelling for her dad. She screamed "Dad" at least 4 times. I don't even know how my girlfriend didn't wake up from this. Then it became quiet, and my heart was pounding. At first, My girlfriend thought I was just having a bad dream, or something like that. But the scream was all too real. This experience was terrifying, but this wasn't the only time someone heard the screaming. About 2 months later, her neighbor texted her in a group chat, asking if anyone heard screaming. And then, exactly a week later, another neighbor heard it as well. Almost exactly another week goes by, and her friend, who lives a couple of streets down, had roommates that texted each other, asking about if they heard the screaming at 2 a.m. At this point, it seems pretty clear. It could be some sort of luring for trafficking. Less than a month later, around 11:30 p.m., my girlfriend's roommate thought she heard a girl screaming, "Get off!" And she looked out the window, but didn't see anything. That was the last time someone heard anything. These events seem very planned, and the fact that my girlfriend lives with 2 other girls alone in a house without a deadlock makes it even worse.
A few years ago, I lived in my car. I was fresh out of college and overwhelmed with student debt. And being young, dumb, and 21, I thought car living was a good way to save money. I live in Southern California, so the rent is high and the weather is temperate enough to make this possible year-round. One night, I decided to park in a neighborhood I thought I knew well. It was right by the beach and a couple blocks next to an ex-boyfriend of mine, so I felt safe there, as I had walked the streets at night plenty of times. I parked, locked the doors, hung up the curtains so no one could look in, plugged in my earplugs so the cars passing wouldn't wake me, and fell asleep. Now my earplugs were effective, but crappy, and I could always count on them falling off in the middle of the night. I actually preferred this because it meant I could fall asleep, but still hear my phone alarm in the morning. It was about 2 a.m. when I woke up to my earplugs already have fallen off, and something feeling wrong. Odd scratching noises were coming from the window. It started at the passenger side door, and then moved to the back seat doors. I froze, unsure of what to make of it, painfully aware that I leave my windows slightly cracked at night for ventilation. I honestly didn't know what to do, so I stayed frozen, trying to make sense of it all. That's when the flashlight turned on, and some man unmistakably was shining his light in, trying to find a crack in the curtains, and to my horror, he found one and shined it right where my face was. It's hard to explain, but the position of my head made it so I could piece together what was happening, based on the light everywhere, but he couldn't see my eyes. The scratching then continued, and I knew I was screwed. This went from potential attempted car theft to someone knowing I was in the car. I was literally paralyzed with fear and couldn't will myself to grab the baseball bat that I had. I wish I could say I screamed something truly bad, but what left my lips was a loud, aggravated, and forceful, "Excuse me." It was super lame, but it echoed. To my immense relief, I hear the sounds of his footsteps running away at top speed. But I kid you not, the man was laughing as he ran like it was some kind of game. I was still paralyzed, but eventually, him running gave me the courage to get up, grab my bat, and shove my way to the front seat, where I started the car and sped away. I didn't see him, and I spent the night at a friend's house. I live in an apartment now. It wasn't until the next morning I realized I had parked 1 block away from a bar, and, at the time of the incident, the bar had just closed.
I was home alone for the week. My family had gone on vacation and I had to stay home and work. It was about 2 a.m. I had stayed up late to watch a scary movie in the dark of my basement. I was intent on really scaring myself and seeing how far into terror I could really go, while still knowing I was safe in my own home. It was then that I heard the pounding of footsteps on the first floor. This was a common and annoying occurrence when my family was home. Every time they would pass through the front hallway, past the basement door, I would hear their footsteps. This time, fear immediately shot through me at the sound. My reflex was to turn the television off immediately. The basement door was up a flight of steps and around the corner, so whoever it was wouldn't have seen any light. I heard the basement door click and turn. As I sat in absolute darkness, I moved slowly so as to be absolutely silent. I crawled behind our large television. As I passed it inch by inch, I noted with panic that its black screen still dimly glowed. I heard footsteps coming down the carpeted but creaky stairs. I froze in my hiding place, listening. For many long minutes, I heard nothing. Had the intruder seen the television's afterglow, or did it fade out in time? Was he standing in the pitch dark, listening for me? I stayed there in the total silence for what felt like eternity. My panic state began to fade, and I began to think more clearly. Did I really hear an intruder? Could someone possibly be standing there in the silence for so long without making any noise? The basement was so exceedingly quiet that the silence itself began to hurt my ears. Could the unknown person really avoid any noise from shuffling or breathing or anything else? If there was an intruder, he was still in the basement, because the creaky stairs were a dead giveaway. The door handle would click, and he wouldn't know how to hide his footsteps on the first floor, so they couldn't be heard down here. I began counting in my head, trying to pass the time. Drool fell from my mouth onto the carpet. I was too afraid to even swallow. I counted to 60, once, twice, and several more times. After a while, the fear had faded, and I was more confused than anything. I estimated that I had been crouched behind the TV for almost 2 hours, and I still heard nothing. If there was an intruder, none of this made any sense. Finally, I decided I would have to make a move. If I did nothing, eventually the sun would come up and shine in through the small basement windows. And worse, I began to smell something rotten. Slowly, I began inching my way towards the stairs, sticking close to the walls. If someone was standing there in the dark, I should be able to go around them and make a break up the stairs. Meanwhile, the horrible odor I was smelling grew stronger. Had something died down here in the night? No living person would smell like that. Some terrible images of some corpse monster listening for me in the dark erupted in my thoughts, and I moved as fast as I could without making a sound. As I finally reached the stairs, there came a loud sound, as if something collapsed onto the floor. It was at that moment I leapt forward and tore my way up the stairs, running through the open basement door and my opened front door, now certain that someone was in my house. I called the police from my cell phone and watched my house from down the street. The police eventually came. They checked the inside of my house and then came back out to question me. They found the body of my elderly neighbor on my basement floor. He seemed to have been dead for quite some time. Their belief was that I must have left the front door unlocked and someone must have wandered inside my house with the body of my neighbor. What the hell was that loud noise that prompted me to bolt up the stairs and out of the house? I asked the police, and they confirmed. The back door to my house was also found open. There was someone else in the basement with us, silent, waiting, and listening in the dark, holding the rotting corpse of my neighbor.
If you really like my content and want to support me, please like this video and click the subscribe button. It helps me to grow my channel as essential in reaching a wider audience. Most of you watching my videos aren't subscribed to my channel, and that's why my animations can't reach their full potential. They aren't recommended to more people who would surely love my content as much as you do. You can always unsubscribe at any moment. Thank you in advance, and enjoy the rest of the video.
I was hanging out with a bunch of my friends over Thanksgiving break. We all go to different colleges, so this was one of the few times that we were actually able to get together. The group consisted of the usual suspects, which included Adam, Zach, Luke, Brandon, Mario, and myself. We always ended up at Mario's house and would tend to keep to the basement because of its size and seclusion from any unwanted attention. Mario's house is giant, and his basement is no exception. Apart from being very spacious, the basement is also nicely furnished, carpeted, and very comfortable to stay in. During most of our get-togethers, there's a fair amount of drinking, and after a while of being cooped up in the basement, my friends and I started to get rowdy and wanted to drive out to the local club. I'm not much of a drinker, so I usually stay pretty sober during these events. Thus, I'm usually left as the designated driver for everyone. Normally, I'm alright with driving everyone to the club. But during this specific night, I was really against going out. There were several reasons for this. 1. I would have to drive 5 drunkenly annoying people in my truck the day before Thanksgiving, which has the reputation of being the day with the most drunk drivers. I didn't want any of my friends to get an underage drinking violation, even though several of them already had one. I would also get into trouble if the police happened to find alcohol in my bloodstream, which they definitely would have. The second reason why I didn't want to go to the club because there was a high probability that one or several of my friends would end up in a fight. They tended to provoke people when they're drunk. This again leads to the police and underage drinking and all that damaging stuff. I really wanted to stay at Mario's and just hang out in the basement, but they were adamant about going out, and it was 5-1, so I finally caved in. And as the time came closer to leaving, my friends became more and more rambunctious. I had to go upstairs in order to retrieve my keys, so I left my loud friends roughhousing in the basement. I found my keys resting on a table in Mario's kitchen, but while I was walking over to get them, the lights went out. I stood still wondering what the hell just happened. But a few seconds later, the lights came back on. I didn't really think much about it, and went over to grab my keys off the table. That's when I noticed something else, and stopped moving. I couldn't hear the muffled noises that my friends were making below me anymore. I just shrugged it off, assuming that they had started to calm down, which was a good sign. I went back downstairs, but I was surprised to find that none of my friends were there anymore, and started heading towards the driveway myself. I got to where the cars were parked, but once again my friends were nowhere to be found. Everyone drove up to Mario's house separately, intoxicated. But I counted the cars, and saw that all of them were still there. It was the middle of November, so it was cold as shit out, and I wanted to go back inside. But I decided to take a quick lap around the exterior of the house, just in case they were out there smoking or something. I walked around the entire house, but I didn't see or hear anything. So I went back inside through the back door. They still weren't in the basement, but they could have gone upstairs without me knowing. Since the basement is so big, there are 2 stairwells on either side of the room that were separated by a wall. I deduced that while I was coming down one of the stairwells, my friends had gone up the other one, probably looking for me. I went up to the first floor again and looked around for my friends, but once again, I couldn't find anybody. There was no way they went up to the second floor. The last thing that Mario would want was to wake up his dad while he was drinking. I went up anyway and looked around for my friends, trying to make as little noise as possible. I couldn't find them on the second floor. The only place left inside the house was the attic, but that was almost impossible for them to get into. They would need a chair just to reach the handle, and it was also locked from the outside. At this point, I was annoyed and confused. Where the hell did they go? I went back down to the basement and called Mario on my phone. It started to ring, but I could hear the on the coffee table next to me. Mario had left his phone. I tried calling Zach. It went straight to voicemail. I tried calling Luke. Same thing. Then Adam and Brandon. Every single one went straight to voicemail. I didn't know what to do at this point besides wait. I just sat there on the couch alone in the basement. I wasn't moving at all. I was just listening to nothing. It was really creepy in the basement all by myself. I don't want to come off as cliché by saying that it was almost too quiet, but that's exactly what it was. It's hard to describe the stillness that I was feeling. The best way I could put it was that I could literally hear the silence around me. I was starting to freak myself out and wanted to turn on the TV. I was about to stand up and get the remote when I heard something. It was very soft, but I knew I heard it. I stood still and let the silence consume me. After a few seconds, I heard the same thing again. It was still very soft, but I could tell what it was. It was snickering. The kind of snickering that you make whenever you try to suppress a laugh by putting your hand over your mouth. That's when it hit me. My friends were hiding somewhere and laughing at me. They obviously didn't want to be found, which is why they were trying to hold back their laughter. Once I figured out what the noise was, I became very annoyed. My friends were intentionally hiding from me even though I was getting genuinely worried about where they were. I got up and started looking around for them again, thoroughly checking all the closets in the basement. There were a lot of them. While I was looking, the snickering started to become more distinguished, but I couldn't figure out where it was coming from. I was at the end of the room, and I would hear the snickering behind me, but once I went over to the opposite end of the basement, I would hear it behind me again. As I mentioned before, the basement is a big area, with a lot of closets and closed rooms, but there are only so many places that a person can hide, and I felt like I checked all of them. Yet the damn snickering was still going on, and it was very noticeable at this point. Then, all at once, it stopped. It cut off out of nowhere, and the lights went out once again. There was no way that my friends could choreograph a stunt like this, especially while they had been drinking. Something was wrong. Something felt off, and it was at that exact moment I started to become scared. Standing in the middle of the dark basement, not moving, and was once again in complete and utter silence. It felt like I was in a nightmare and wanted to wake up more than anything. Instead, I just stood there, too petrified to move. That's when I could hear footsteps. The floor was carpeted, so they were quiet, but I could hear them clear as day. They were coming from my right, but they weren't the type of footsteps that you would expect. These were very particular. They were taken slowly, carefully. Each step was followed by a few seconds of silence, as if whatever was walking did not want to be heard. Something was creeping closer to me. I dared not move my body, but I searched frantically with my eyes, trying to see what was approaching. It was still pitch black, but I could swear I could make out a figure advancing towards me from the right. I closed my eyes and started to cry. I couldn't help it. Warm tears slid down my cheeks as I braced myself for the worst. Then the lights came back on, and I almost screamed. I looked around, but there was no one in the basement with me. The snickering was gone, and I felt lightheaded from the amount of terror that was flowing through me. I was horrified, and I didn't want to be in that room by myself any longer. I still had no idea where my friends were, and as much as I wanted to leave, I still didn't want to leave them behind. If this was some kind of elaborate prank that my friends were trying to scare me with, it worked. But the joke was over, and they would have to come out of hiding by now. I texted each of my friends saying that I was going to leave if they didn't come out. I tried calling each of them 3 times, but like before, they all went straight to voicemail, except for Mario's, which was still buzzing on the coffee table. I told myself that I would give them 5 more minutes to respond, and then I was out of there. 5 minutes passed, and I was leaving through the back door and heading towards my truck. It was almost 2 o'clock in the morning at this point. I was tired, scared, and annoyed. I honestly didn't know what to make of the situation. Once I got home, I started to realize how stupid I was for thinking that there was some monster in the basement with me. I knew my friends were just trying to scare me for whatever reason, and I'm sure that I gave them the exact reaction that they were looking for, me crying by myself in the dark. They probably had it on video too, and were going to post it on every single media platform they could. I no longer felt bad for leaving them behind. As a matter of fact, I felt betrayed by them. I spent over an hour worrying about where my friends had disappeared to, and tried looking for them, and in return they scared the living shit out of me and made me feel like I'm an idiot. I went to bed and waited anxiously for the morning to come so I could give my friends hell for what they did. When I woke up the next morning, I immediately went for my phone and was shocked to find that Mario had sent me a text around 3:30 a.m. I opened the text to find nothing but gibberish. It clearly looked like a drunk text. I really wasn't surprised by this. Mario had sent me many drunk texts before. It was almost 11 a.m., and if the guys had stayed up all night drinking, there was no way that any of them were awake yet. I decided to wait it out and make them call me first. It wasn't too long after I woke up that I received another message. This time it was from Mario's dad. "Did you guys go somewhere? I can't seem to find anybody. I actually left last night. I don't know if they went somewhere, but I couldn't find them either. Have you tried calling or texting any of them? I keep getting their voicemail." "Yeah, I'm getting the same thing." "Alright, well if Mario or anybody else calls, you tell them to call me so I know where they are." "Will do." About 2 hours later, Mario's dad texted me again. "Hey, have you heard anything from your friends yet? Mario and I were supposed to go somewhere today, but he still isn't answering his phone." "No, sorry, I haven't heard anything from them yet." I still hadn't told them about the drunken text, because Mario's dad hates it whenever Mario and his friends come over to drink. Around 4 p.m., Mario's dad messages me once again. "Have you heard anything yet? I'm starting to get worried. All the other parents are starting to call me asking me where everyone is. I've tried calling Mario and everyone else over and over again, but none of them are answering." "I still haven't heard anything, but I'll try calling them myself. Don't worry, I'm sure they're fine. They probably stayed up all night over someone else's house, and have been sleeping in all day." "Okay, just please tell me if you hear anything." I started texting and calling my friends again, but I still wasn't getting anything. Another 3 hours go by. It's a little past 7 at this point. I was starting to get very worried, but I didn't realize how serious the situation was until I got a knock on the door. It was the police. They informed me that Mario's dad and several of the other parents reported their sons missing. I was driven back to Mario's house and was greeted by several other police officers, as well as all of my friends' worried parents. The parents kept asking me questions about what we were doing last night and where their children had gone, but I honestly didn't know. I just kept reassuring them that everybody was alright, but after a while, even I was starting to doubt myself. 2 police officers, one skinny and one fat, escorted me into the basement. They kept asking me questions and I answered as best as I could, but I was starting to become delirious from everything that was happening. I told them the whole story, starting from when I went upstairs to get my car keys. I told them about the snickering and how the lights went out. I told them about the figure I saw creeping towards me in the dark. At this point, I didn't care how crazy it sounded. I just wanted my friends to be okay. I told them about the drunken text I got last night, and when I showed them the message, the fat cop took my phone and walked away with it. I was left with the skinny police officer, who continued to ask me questions. I asked him if Mario's dad had found his phone on the coffee table. The officer told me that Mario's dad found no such thing. I informed the officer that I distinctly remembered seeing Mario's phone on the coffee table, and had assumed that he retrieved it later, which would explain the drunken text I got from him last night. He wrote down a couple more notes and left, telling me to stay where I was. I was back in the basement, standing almost exactly where I was when the lights went out. The scene now, compared to last night, was completely different. There were detectives everywhere looking over everything, dusting for fingerprints and asking questions. I closed my eyes and zoned out for a while. I was sucked back into reality when the fat officer yelled for me to come over. He was standing next to some geeky-looking guy wearing glasses. Once I got over to them, the fat cop asked me if I was playing some kind of sick joke. Stunned, I asked him what he was talking about. The guy with the glasses was the first to answer. He informed me that the text that Mario had sent me last night was not gibberish. It was Latin, and translated to,
"Your friends are with me now."
For some context, I'm a 16-year-old male. Last year I got into a horrible accident which resulted in me almost dying. Because of that accident, my chest and my breathing starts to hurt at random moments. My limbs also start to shake uncontrollably. Anyways, I live and was raised in the countryside. We live on a really big property with a lot of bushes and trees. I'm also very paranoid and I don't typically trust any strangers. So it's 1:30 in the morning and I'm watching a movie while on the couch. My parents were asleep and my sister was out of town drinking when suddenly I saw the motion detecting light flip on outside. The shutters were shut, but the light was so bright that you could actually see cracks of light coming right through the shutters. Then I heard the back door start to rattle. I thought it was just my sister who had come home from drinking. She didn't come in for another 20 minutes though, so I asked her what she was doing staying outside that long. "What do you mean? I just came home," she said. I brushed it off thinking that it must have been the wind because there was a very heavy storm going on that night. Me and my sister part ways for the night and we both go to bed. The next night it's 1:15 a.m. and I was making myself a sandwich in the kitchen which connects to the garage. I also want to add that my dog and cat also sleep in the garage. Then out of nowhere, my dog started going crazy, barking really loud. At first I thought he was barking at the cat, but when he didn't stop after a minute, that's when I started to get suspicious. Then I remembered what went down last night. Like I said before, I'm really paranoid, so I go to grab my knife since all of the guns are kept in the garage. Just when I'm about to go into the garage, my dog finally shuts up. I put my ear against the garage door for several minutes. Nothing. Really freaked out, I just decided to go to bed. I decided I would tell my parents about it the next day, but they just brushed it off. It's now the next night, and it's 1:46 a.m. At this point, I was honestly just expecting for the dog to start barking, with my knife in hand. And there it was. My dog started going absolutely ballistic yet again. This time I rushed to the garage, and just as I'm approaching it, I then start to hear shuffling in the garage. Now I'm positive somebody's in there. I slammed open the door, and what do you know? Nothing. I searched the entire fucking garage, and still nothing. I tell my mom since my dad was on a business trip. I told her that we might need to call the police. She didn't believe me, and she actually forbade me from calling the cops. I went back downstairs thinking I was going crazy. Maybe this really was just all in my head. And that's when I then heard a whistle right through the window. I then ran to the window and opened the shutters. Nothing. I started walking to the garage when I heard another tap, followed by another whistle at the kitchen window. I swung open the blinds to see the motion sensor light on. I burst in the garage to grab a shotgun, but it's empty. I was looking everywhere for the ammo, but I couldn't find one single shell anywhere. That's when I then realized that the shotgun ammo wasn't the only ammo that was missing. All of the ammo, rifle, pistol, revolver, and shotgun were all gone. Then I heard 3 taps right on the garage door right next to me, followed by yet another whistle and a laugh. Luckily, I knew where my dad had kept the spare ammo hidden at, so I grabbed the shells from the hidden stash, which was luckily not found by the guy. I go back inside the living room to hear more taps and whistles at every fucking window. The living room window, the kitchen, the game room, the garage, everywhere. The guy kept tapping and whistling and sometimes laughing at every fucking window. I really have no idea how he was managing this. We live in a really huge house. He must have been literally sprinting around the house, and even if he was, it would be almost impossible to keep this up. I was waiting outside the kitchen door for him to show up at the window, and there it was, the taps and the whistle and that damn laugh. I then burst out the door, locked and loaded. He was gone, or so I thought, because when I then looked up, I saw a tall, slim black shape in a hoodie right on the roof. Just when I'm about to shoot it, I drop to the ground, unable to breathe because of my condition. While I lay there on the cold ground, I aim my gun at the guy on the roof, but my body starts to shake uncontrollably, also because of my condition. The guy jumps down, and I kid you not, he puts his fucking lips right on my ear and starts whistling. I lay there pretty sure I'm about to die, when he then starts walking off in the direction of my pool. After 2 or 3 minutes, I scramble myself up using my shotgun as a sort of walking stick because my legs are still shaking. I thought that he was now gone, so I went back inside. This time when I told my mom, she finally believed me. But just right when we were about to call the cops, we take a look outside the window, and I kid you not, we actually saw this guy's head popping out from the pool. The cops eventually arrived and they searched the property. They found all the missing ammo in our shed. They also found muddy footprints all around our property. And get this, the words "oh no" carved in the wall. We also managed to find out that he got inside the garage by moving a heavy metal plate which blocked a hole to the outside. An absolute nightmare. So to the whistling, psychotic, laughing maniac, I dare you to come back so I can finish the job this time. When I was an infant, I was in a freak accident where a gun in the back of my parents' pickup had actually misfired and the bullet went through my mom's wrist, both top and bottom, and then the bullet entered through my left foot right on the side and up through the top. I still have my foot and I got super lucky. Fast forward about 34 years. It's now March 2018. I'm battling one of the worst ear infections I've ever had. I had barely slept for days because I couldn't lay my head flat without bawling my eyes out. My fiancé Steve had been working construction and he takes sleeping meds in order to fall asleep. So we go to bed on this Thursday night as he had to work early in the morning on the Friday. I was finally beating the ear infection, so this night I was totally out, sleeping so heavy for the first time in days. I awoke to a noise but just assumed Steve was getting up to go to the bathroom or something, so I dozed right back off, but then I heard yelling. I'm in a brain fog and my brain isn't awake or processing anything. I heard more yelling, so I remember jumping out of the bed and standing up in the dark, and I was able to comprehend that it was Steve yelling. For some reason, I thought that maybe the cops were in my house or something, but the first words my brain actually understood were,
"Give me the money."
Wait, what? The cops don't yell that. What the hell's going on here? Steve is buck naked in all his glory, charging at these assailants, and then he slams our bedroom door, trying to keep them from getting into the room where I am. These bastards try swinging the door open, and Steve slams the door shut again. All of a sudden, I start hearing popping noises. These motherfuckers were actually shooting at us. I watch Steve Spider-Man around the room trying to not take a bullet, but keeping our door shut so they can't get to me. I hear Steve yelling, "Get the gun! Get the gun!" And my brain is thinking, why on earth would I charge these intruders and get their gun? Like I said before, I was sleeping super hard and the brain fog in my brain in stupid mode. I finally realized that he's talking about getting our gun. Yeah, I'm a dumbass. So I click the light on, grab our gun, and then hand it to Steve. These junky piece of shit intruders have now ran out the very same way they came in, through the back door. Apparently my idiot roommate hadn't locked the back door. Anyways, I'm now shaking and I'm damn near hysterical at this point. Steve was grazed by 2 of the 6 bullets that had been shot at us. I spent an entire month tending to his wounds and nursing him back to health. We also got a dog and we installed a home security system. I sometimes still put a chair under the doorknob some nights, and I haven't had a good night's sleep in like 2 years. Most nights Steve would have slept right through anything due to the meds, and I would have woke up to them. But by some miracle he heard them first and protected me and himself like a true hero. He wasn't even supposed to be home yet. He was supposed to be in Florida until the next week, but came home early. I absolutely tremble at what these two armed robbers would have done to a woman all alone sleeping heavily and having no clue that they were there until it was too late. I think that I'm cursed, or that the people who love me the most always end up having to take a bullet for me. My mom did it first, and now my fiance has too. It scares me to tears to think that anyone that's close to me keeps having these freak gunshot incidents just for being close to me. To the dirty scumbag piece of shit intruders that broke into my house and took away my sense of security, I really fucking hope karma gets you. I work as a security guard for an alarm response company. We answer alarms for businesses and private residences. 99% of the time, it's usually a motion detector set off by a cat, or a restaurant forgot to disarm their stuff before the stock truck arrived to unload. In this specific case, I was called out to a house where the back door alarm was set off, like it thought someone opened it. The owner was out of town, but she was alerted by her app, and she had her mother meet me there. We checked the door. It's locked. We figured that maybe someone tried the door but that it didn't budge, then setting off the alarm, but there's a light on inside. The mom mentions this to the daughter on the phone. Daughter says she isn't sure if she left the light on or not. It's a good idea to make people think someone's home, but she isn't sure. Well, that gave me a bad tingle. The mother wanted to go inside to check, but she didn't have a spare key. The neighbor did, but they were asleep and the mom didn't want to wake them. So I fill out my papers and go back to my normal patrol routes. An hour later, the same home sends an alert out. Now, I'm the only one in my city zone, so I answer it again. When I pull up, police and CSI are there talking to the mother and now the awake neighbor. They're reviewing the video footage sent to them by the daughter. I look at the footage. There were 4 armed men wearing masks and hoodies that came out of the bathroom literally a minute after the mother and I left. They proceeded to rob the place. They had apparently broken in and then locked the door behind them for appearances. They're the ones who turned on the light. The mother then told me that 3 guys had robbed her daughter's home about a month before. Somehow they just knew when this girl would be out of town. They appeared smart, desiring a quiet robbery without any conflict. But they brought guns, so I guess they were prepared to shoot their way out of trouble if need be. The mother had wanted to go in that night. If she had had a key or woken the neighbor for the key, we would have likely been shot dead by these guys when we went inside. My work doesn't give me Kevlar vests or anything. If I ever get another house call when someone is there, I am definitely not going inside no matter what is asked of me. I count myself fortunate the way was blocked this time, because I was absolutely prepared to foolishly go in and check if I could. The 1% of calls where something is actually off, it's never been as bad as this one. To those armed robbers, I'm really, really glad we never met.
When I was 14, my high school thought it would be a good idea to take a bunch of us New York City kids into the Catskills for a day. The idea was to introduce us to nature since some of us had spent our entire lives living in the concrete jungle that is New York City. Seriously, a lot of us had only ever seen forests and farms on the TV or in movies, and now that I'm older, I realize how potentially damaging that is. I honestly feel like human beings are supposed to be in contact with nature, that it makes us happier, healthier, and gives us a sense of place. But I'll quit my rambling and get on with the story. So one super early morning, we load onto our school bus for the drive out into the Catskills. This is in like November too, so it was still dark when I got up and the sun had barely risen when the driver got us on the road. I was excited at the time. I had aspirations to be in the military, and the idea of getting to wander around the woods was such a cool concept to me at the time. In the end, it actually turned out to be pretty boring and really tiring. We walked for hours and hours with our teacher telling us about different kinds of trees, animals, and weather systems that the area was home to. But we didn't even really get to see any of those animals aside from the odd squirrel that was squirreling away nuts. It turns out some of them don't hibernate at all, unlike a lot of woodland creatures. Like I said, it was all much more boring than I first thought. That was, right up until I saw something carved into a tree. It was carved in really deep, obviously with some kind of knife or something, right through the bark and into the wood. I'd never seen anything like it before, and it wasn't like I wasn't a smart kid. I used to read about different religions and occult stuff quite a lot, so I was pretty confused as to what it was. To describe it, it looked like a rough figure 8, but with like dots and lines carved around it in certain places, so that it kind of looked like an octopus, only not at all at the same time. I know that makes literally zero sense, and I wish this was when camera phones were a thing because I'd probably still have the pictures with me to link people to. Out of curiosity, I call my teacher over and ask her if she recognized it. She gives the thing pretty much the same look as I figured I had, just having no idea what she's looking at, then obviously tells me no, that she's never seen anything like it before. But that in all likelihood it's something a hunter carved into the trees so they wouldn't get lost. I'd not really heard of anyone doing that before, but I kind of figured she knew best, so I dropped the whole thing and just followed the group as we walked on. After a little while, we ended up walking right to the edge of a cliff face near a mountain. It was this huge wall of rock that just seemed to rise up out of the earth, covered in moss and stuff. Our teacher starts pointing at the rock and telling us how we can tell how old it is by the different kinds of rock that the thing was made up of, but few of us were really listening. I only really started paying attention myself as we walked along the cliff face, and I saw something familiar on it. Something big, too. It was the same symbol we'd seen carved into the tree, only like I said, this one was much, much bigger. Again, I showed our teacher, only this time, she didn't seem so calmly curious, and she seemed as freaked out as I did. Not only that, but the entire class saw it this time, but with it being the first time seeing it, they weren't nearly as scared, just the same curious I was. I asked the teacher quietly who might carve something like that into the rock, who might have the time or the skills or the equipment. She just told me she didn't know, but not to mention the ones that we'd seen carved into the trees. Plural. She used the plural, and it honestly scared me more than it should have. I'd only seen the one carved into the tree, but she'd obviously seen a lot more than I had. I just found myself hoping we'd be heading back soon. It was early afternoon by that time, and I wondered just how scary the woods would be after dark. Thankfully, I started heading back towards the bus not long after eating lunch. A little while into our walk, one kid stops the teacher and tells her he needs to go to the bathroom. It wasn't an ideal situation by any means, but with the kid being a dude, it was pretty easy to remedy. Teacher just tells him to go into the bushes nearby and deal with it, so he does. A few minutes later, we hear him tearing through the bushes back towards us, panting as he ran. He emerges with this terrified look in his eyes, like I've never seen anyone so scared before, not in real life. The teacher runs over and starts asking him what the deal is, but he can hardly get his words out. He just keeps breathing real fast, in and out, like rocking back and forth on the spot like he was losing his mind. The teacher is telling him to breathe, calm down and focus, and tell us what he saw. What he said shook our group to the core. There was a man, a real old man, or not so old. He had white hair and a beard, and he didn't have any clothes on, but he was covered in like tattoos. Oh my God. Oh God, what if he saw me? What if he's following us? The teacher had to quiet the kid before a full-blown panic attack took over the group, and we hurried back to the bus without stopping to look at anything at all. Nothing else happened on the walk back to the bus, but thank God. But I remember being really curious as to what the kid thought he saw when he went to the bathroom, and I foolishly asked. He told me exactly the same thing, only went into a little more detail about the tattoos and stuff. I asked him if he remembered what they looked like, to draw on one of them if he could. He took out a notebook and pen, closed his eyes for a moment so he could really recall. Then he drew something rough that I couldn't quite make out at first, but when he showed it, it was clear. It was a bunch of dots and lines, with a clear figure 8 in the middle. For a good few years, I was a teacher at Lansdowne Middle School in Victoria, British Columbia. I loved my job. Teaching wasn't something I'd ever really seen myself doing. It certainly wasn't a career I'd talked about with high school guidance counselors. I kind of fell into it by accident. Long story short, I couldn't get into the college I wanted to, so I had to basically choose between that and nursing, so I chose the one with less blood and guts involved. Every year we take a bunch of grade 8 students up to a place called Camp Barnard at Otter Point, just west of Souk. It's a scout camp built on land gifted by Senator George Henry Barnard, who was a prominent advocate of hunting and outdoor activities in general. There are a lot of fun things for the kids to get up to up at the camp. There's a playing field, a nature trail, a swimming pool, a lake for canoeing and paddleboarding, even an archery range and disc golf course. The kids absolutely adore heading up there for a few days, and there's always a palpable feeling of excitement every year in the run-up to the field trip up there. And I'd be lying if I said I didn't look forward to it too. That kind of stuff really brings out the big kid in me, you know? It was the last week of the school year when we piled onto a bus and drove over to the camp to begin our few days of fun. The weather is normally pretty peachy during that time of year, but last year, there were some unusually strong winds blowing through the camp. This was very disappointing, as it meant that some of the activities would be totally out of the question. You can't play disc golf when the winds can effectively blow your disc right off the entire course, and neither can you paddleboard when your board keeps getting flipped over by choppy waters. That only really left a handful of activities open to the kids, one of which was archery, the other was orienteering. I'll be honest, I was excited to try archery again. I'd tried it the year before the first time, and I'd actually fought to get assigned to it again since I'd just found the whole thing so cool. I had my reservations about the wind, but they were purely minor concerns about it affecting the kids' accuracy. It'd really suck if a few of the more talented archers were unable to nail a bullseye or two thanks to the winds. But these were thin polycarbon projectiles. I doubted the wind would have any serious effect on them. But it wasn't the wind I had to worry about. You see, we had this one kid with us who was a real klutz. They sucked at sports, always seemed to be that kid who ended up in the nurse's office from falling in the schoolyard. Everybody knows a kid like that, right? And this was our clumsy kid. So the kid, who I won't name to protect their future reputations, steps up to the firing line with their bow and arrow in hand, fires off a couple of terrible shots, but I'm quick to offer encouragement. The instructor even takes a little more time to show him the correct stance, how to stand just right so that the arrow flies straight and true towards its target. But when the kid tries to imitate the instructor, he takes up the goofiest pose I think I'd ever seen. Body turned sideways, legs spread way too far apart, and they even instinctually squatted down as if to try to lower their center of gravity, as if that was going to help in the slightest. Then, just before they're about to shoot off another arrow, this huge, and I mean huge gust of wind starts tearing its way through the camp, and I watched in horror as the kid began to sway, falling backwards and shooting his arrow way off target. The instructor kept his cool, managed to keep the kids from freaking out, but immediately shot me a look as if to say, time to call it a day. Next came the orienteering, about the only truly safe thing to do during this kind of weather. At least, that's what I thought anyway. Sure, the maps were flapping away in our hands as we tried to navigate our way around the course, but it was still pretty fun despite the weather. Fun, right up until I heard a crashing sound coming from just over a rise. The kids I was supervising looked around in confusion, their eyes full of fear as they wondered aloud what the sound was. I told them I wasn't sure, and we'd have to wait to check it out once the course had been completed. But that was a lie. I knew well what it was. I'd heard it before. It was the sound of a tree falling in the woods. It's frankly unmistakable, a deep wrenching sound, then the clacking of the lumber hitting other upright trees before the final crash as it hits the dirt. I had this horrible feeling in my gut. There were kids all over the area, all taking part in the orienteering exercise in small groups, each overseen by a member of the camp or teaching staff. And it was probably the worst moment of my life so far to realize that my worst fears had come true. I saw a kid bounding over the rise, his eyes, these big, white circles beaming out from his terrified face. I called after him, trying to get him to tell me what had just happened, and he didn't say anything. He just sprinted back towards camp as fast as his little legs could carry him. I tried to keep the kids from worrying too much, but they couldn't concentrate on the task at hand. They seemed to know something was horribly wrong just as clearly as I did. So, after a few more minutes of trying to control the situation, I just walked us all back to camp to try to get them settled in their bunks. I'll just cut to the chase at this point. The fallen tree had landed right on one of the kids, who I won't name to protect their family. And, believe it or not, he was dead just moments later from massive chest trauma and asphyxiation. The school district's critical incident response team was deployed on the Wednesday afternoon to support students, staff, and families. But with the yearly graduation ceremony that was only a week away, it was completely ruined for a lot of families, and even those that attended felt a sense of pervading sorrow and loss. And as for me, I've never really gotten over the fact that such horrifically random tragedies can occur to completely innocent children. I took advantage of the free counseling services provided by the school district, but they just didn't seem to help. I found myself looking at kids, wondering what completely random accident would take their lives before they even blossomed into fully grown adults.
This happened when I was in the 5th grade. I was in a science class, and one day we all took a field trip to a science museum. It had a bunch of exhibits and things like that. I really wasn't much of a science fan, but I will admit that I always liked going to the museum because it was pretty fun. We left school and drove down to the museum, which was about 30 minutes away. Once we got there, we did the usual stuff. We were able to kind of split up as a group, as long as we made it back. I went with a few of my friends in the class from one spot to another. Eventually, it was time to get lunch, and then we would leave shortly after that. Our teacher went around letting everyone know we would be leaving in 10 minutes and to meet back at the entrance. I had seen everything I was going to see, so I decided to just go back and get on the bus. That way I could play some games on my phone until we were going to leave. I left the building into the back parking lot where our bus had dropped us off. I got out there and saw a couple of buses. I started to walk over and saw the bus driver wave me over to him. I got on the bus, but as I did, the bus driver stopped me. He told me there would be no phones on the way back. I was pretty upset to hear this, and I didn't understand why, but I gave him my phone and then sat down. The bus driver then started the engine. I looked out the window and tried to think of why we weren't allowed to have our phones. Sure, sometimes the kids would get out of control with them, but I found this a little bit unreasonable. Just then, I felt the bus start to move. I looked and saw the driver was driving out of the parking lot and down to the street. I called out that the rest of the class was still inside, but he ignored me. Then I got a terrible feeling. I asked him to stop the bus and go back, but he just turned around and yelled at me to shut up. The bus was driving down the street and headed for the freeway. All I could do was look out the window and wonder what exactly was going on. I wished that I hadn't gone to the bus by myself and went back with the rest of the group. The bus driver merged onto the freeway, and we started going at a fairly high speed. The longer we drove, the more scared that I got. Now I knew the real reason he had taken my phone from me. We continued down the freeway for I would say about 5 minutes. Suddenly, I heard the noise of a police siren. I looked behind me and saw a flashing light. The bus started to move to the side of the road, and I saw a police car go with it. That was one of the greatest feelings in my life. The bus driver then opened the door and took off running into the field beside the road. I saw several police officers run after him, and another run to the bus. They were able to get me back to safety, and the bus driver was caught a short time later. Back when I was a kid, we took a school field trip to the zoo one time. My school was really small, and basically the entire place went. It took us over an hour to get there, but when we were there, it was a day-long event, which was nice for us because we didn't actually have to do any schoolwork. I think I was like 8 years old, and I was one of the younger people there. The first part of the day we spent looking for a bunch of animals, then we got food. After that, we started looking more at plants and things like that. I was more into the animals, so my friend Matt and I went back over to them. We first got back to the exhibit of sea lions, and when we got there, one of the zoo workers asked us if we wanted to help feed the animals. Of course we said yes, because as an 8-year-old kid, it seemed like something super fun to do. He told us to follow him and then led us into a doorway and down a dark and quiet hall. It was really weird to be in the back of an exhibit, but it got me really excited to feed the animals. We followed the guy deeper in and into a storage type of room that was even darker. He said this is where they kept the food. He told us to wait there for a second and left the room. Then we saw the door shut and heard it lock. We immediately knew something was wrong. I went to the door and tried to open it, but it was in fact locked. It was a really strong and thick door, and neither of us would be able to break it. We banged on it, but I don't know how anyone else outside would be able to hear. After a while of that with no response, we decided to examine the room. It was very dark with no apparent lights, and we could barely see. It was probably just about 15 feet by 10 feet, and had basically just junk laying around. It just seemed to be another storage closet. We waited and waited, but of course, the guy never came back, and nobody else did either. This was kind of a long time ago, and neither of us had cell phones we could take out to call anyone or anything like that. We just waited in the dark room for what felt like forever. Occasionally we would yell or bang on the door, but nothing would ever happen. We did this for literally hours. At one point we stopped and actually fell asleep on the floor for some time. Eventually we got back up and went back to banging on the door and yelling. At last, finally, we could barely hear someone from the other side. We both yelled as loud as we possibly could. The door tried to open, but was still locked. Then whoever was there went away. We got really disappointed and thought that was it, until a few minutes later we saw the door open. There was another zoo worker, and she asked us how we had gotten in there. We told her the story, and she seemed really surprised. By that time, we saw that the sun was almost set when we got back into the zoo. Apparently, everyone had been looking for us for over 2 hours. We were able to get back home later that day, but the guy that worked there and locked us in had left, and nobody could find him. It turns out he was caught a while later, and had been addicted to some drugs or something like that. They said he had been acting really strange lately. I really don't know why he locked us in there, but we were very lucky to get out because that closet wasn't really used by the zoo anymore. This story happened many years ago when I was a boy. I was probably about 9 or 10, and I remember for class we went on a field trip to one of the state parks. It was just a field trip where we were going to walk around and look at the sights and the wildlife. We went on these trips about 4 times a year, and it was always pretty fun. On this day we went to a park that had a bunch of hills and different types of trees. We were going to walk on a path all around it. There was about 20 of us in the class, and after we all got to the park, our teacher told us to follow him and then led us down the path. I was with my best friend Daryl, and we were talking during the walk. At one point, we saw a cool-looking mushroom a little bit off the path, so we stayed back to look at it. The rest of the class was going uphill, and before we knew it, they were out of sight. We went to run to catch back up with them, but we heard a noise coming from behind a tree off the path. I expected to see an animal, but when we looked, there was a boy there around our age. He had a red shirt and jeans, and he was hiding behind the tree. He wasn't in our class. We asked him who he was, but he didn't answer. We thought maybe he was with another school field trip over here or something like that. Daryl asked him if he was on a field trip, and the boy stepped out from the tree and said, "No, Daryl." Daryl was really surprised that the kid knew his name, and he asked him how he knew. The boy then looked at me and said my name. It was a little strange, this whole thing, and we said we should all go back with our groups. The boy then went back behind the tree. He was definitely sketchy, but we told him he should come with us because we figured he wasn't supposed to be off the path by himself out here. He didn't come out from behind the tree though, so me and Daryl walked over to him. But when we got behind the tree, the boy wasn't there. It was as if he just vanished into thin air and was gone. Daryl and I looked around for a bit, but then we knew we had to get back to our group, so we ran back. We told our teacher about it, and I know we ended up telling people who worked at the park about the kid, but I never heard anything about it after that. Daryl and I still talk about it sometimes to this day.
This happened a while ago. I have since been diagnosed with PTSD because of this incident. I'm currently on medication to suppress the recurring nightmares. For some background, at the time I was only 9 years old. I am a female from Georgia. My mother met my stepfather at a church we recently started attending with her best friend. When this happened, they were just dating. It was a fairly normal church for the most part. It was a somewhat run-down building, with an outdated interior and an old basement. The pastor was an ex-drug addict turned man of God, who was honestly one of the nicest people I've ever met. It was a cold winter night. Saturday church service had just ended. We left the church and headed towards my mom's old Pontiac Vibe. It was the kind of car that didn't have electric locks or windows. Each door had to be locked and unlocked on its own. We sat in the parking lot talking for some time. Since my stepfather lived in a different city back then, he and my mom wanted to maximize their time together. They were discussing upcoming holiday plans when I noticed a figure wearing a green coat moving between the cars parked nearby. I didn't think anything of it at the time, as it could have been our pastor or another churchgoer. My stepdad got into the passenger seat, and we were about to take off, when his door was suddenly pulled open. There was a man in a green hoodie that none of us recognized. He had dark skin, bloodshot eyes, and a shaved head. He looked completely deranged. He shoved a gun into my stepdad's abdomen. "Give me your wallet!" he demanded. Mind you, my stepfather is a Hispanic man. He speaks English well now, but he wasn't fluent back then, and he had a thick accent. So he simply responded to the man, "No." My mom began freaking out. I was so scared that I kept trying to get out of the car. I started crying because my mom told me to stay put. Then the man began screaming, "I said give me your wallet!" But my stepdad stood firm. "No." The man then directed his attention at my mother. "Tell him I said to give me his wallet." Thinking that he couldn't understand him, my mother tried to get my stepdad to comply, but he refused. I'm looking frantically through our fogged-up windows, trying to find someone to get their attention. But the man looked at me, then back to my mom. He then hit my stepdad with his gun, causing him to lean forward. He then pointed the gun at me. A 9-year-old girl in a pink and black dress who was talking about Christmas dinner just 5 minutes before. "Somebody better give me something, or she dies." I lost it. I got out of my seat and exited the car. That's when I saw 2 other hooded men across the parking lot. They were walking towards the car, also carrying guns. I started screaming and immediately got back in the car. My mom yelled at me for getting out, and the man with the gun was still screaming at my stepdad. "Are you listening to me, man? I'm going to shoot her right between the fucking eyes!" My mom then offered him all the cash she had on her. She handed him $75 from her wallet. The man ripped away the cash from her, then assaulted my stepdad again with his gun. The mugger then slammed his arm against the car door to close it, but in the process the gun went off. The bullet went into the well of my mom's car. The 3 men ran off into the night. We sat there crying and trying to console each other. After about 30 minutes, we calmed ourselves down and left. We immediately went to the police station and filed a report. They said it was most likely gang activity, and it would be very difficult to track down the perpetrators. The men could have killed my stepfather right in front of my mother. There was no justice. I was only a child when this happened. It's been 13 years, and I still wake up screaming and sweating from the nightmares. I'm just glad that my mom had her grocery money on her that day. Heaven knows what would have happened if she didn't.
So for context, I'm a 22-year-old male, and I live in a large city in the Midwest. Now, I drive for Lyft while putting myself through trade school. I also drive for other similar companies, but that's besides the point. I have many horror stories from those as well, but I'll tell those another time. It was Christmas Eve 2020. I was out driving for Lyft for a few hours before heading to my mom's with my new baby and wife. Nothing really special going on for the night, just the usual. I get a ride request. It happened to be a pickup from this kinda lower income apartment complex. No big deal. I arrive, find my passenger, and he has all of his belongings with him, like several boxes of stuff. Now, my car is a 2006 Chevy Impala, so it's not really too big. We get all of his stuff loaded up, barely, and we're on our way. Now, during the ride, the guy was crying and saying that his girlfriend was cheating on him, and he had apparently walked in on them earlier that night. He couldn't stay there because her name was on the lease, so I was taking him to a hotel. Now in my city, we happen to have a street that is pretty well known for having vices. Hookers, drugs, gangs, weapons, and shady motels. You know, the works. We get to the motel and he asked me to wait for him to check in and get his key. No problem, man, I say. I'll confess, I break the rules a little when it comes to Lyft. I have a gun hidden in a concealed holster, secured to the underside of my driver's seat for protection. Reason being, driving Lyft and other contract apps, I've had knives and guns pulled on me, as well as having people trying to fight me, rob me, and all kinds of other things. But like I said, stories for another time. This motel was on that street that I had mentioned before. Homeless people were everywhere. There was a dude on the far corner of the complex that still had a needle in his arm, passed right out against the building. And I'm a pretty big fan of true crime and horror narration, so I'm on edge. He gets his key. The whole motel is ground level, so to help the guy out, I drive to his door. As I mentioned before, he had a lot of stuff, so I started to help him unload his stuff. While on my second trip getting stuff, I saw a guy come out of a room just south of my car, then followed by two ladies. They came up to the room I was next to. One of the ladies then pounded on the door, then opened it. That's when I then saw the guy raise a fucking shotgun right out of his long coat and then storm into the room. The two ladies followed him, then slamming the door behind them. Following, I heard a lot of yelling and shouting. I was honestly just waiting for shots to ring out. Out of nowhere, my passenger came up behind me. "I can take this, man. Go ahead and take off. Have a Merry Christmas." And he gave me a cash tip. I didn't even notice that he took the boxes out of my hands or slid a $5. I had to leave, or at least go to where I could get my gun. I know that and then called the cops. I gave them every detail I could. After I got off the phone with the police, I signed out a Lyft. I hadn't made much money, but I was done. I got a call later that night. The cops investigated. They never found the gunmen or the women. They never answered the door that I saw them come out of. And the occupants of the room they went into said nothing happened and that I was full of shit. Well, I definitely wasn't. I know what I saw. We've lived in our neighborhood for nearly 4 years. A few houses down and across the street is a Filipino family. They're pretty nice, and whenever we see each other, we always have small talk and we know each other by name. We moved in right before I gave birth to my oldest, so they always ask for the baby and they love seeing them. We have even had meals at each other's homes before. This summer, they had an older family member, maybe 55 to 60 years old, come to visit. We noticed him right away because he would always go for long walks and lingered a lot. One evening, the mother of the family introduced him as her father. He had recently moved and would be staying with them for a while before heading north to her sister's house. He was pretty new to the US and spoke a little English, just enough to get by. He seemed nice enough, but as soon as we walked inside, I told my husband that he gave me a really weird vibe. I had never felt that way of any of the 7 other family members from the home. I've been in their home and shared meals with them. They're very sweet and welcoming. My husband also told me that he did seem a little off, but we just chalked it up to cultural differences. Fast forward about a month. My mother-in-law and my mother came to visit at the very same time. They're in the driveway with our son. I run inside because I'm pregnant and I suffer from severe morning sickness. I come back out 15 minutes later and they're having a frustrating conversation with this man. He was trying to get one of them to drive him to the store and he would use a food stamp/EBD card to buy their groceries and wanted them to give him cash. They both told him that they weren't interested, but he just kept asking and lingering. When I went outside, I called out to my husband to come out, and when he saw us, he walked away very quickly. Both of our mothers told us what had happened and how forceful that he was being with them. The next few days that I see him walking, we always wave and say simple pleasantries, but every time I would wave, he would take it as a sign to come over and try to have a conversation. I began to let him know that what he did with our mothers is very illegal and to be so forceful was really unnecessary. He said that he understood, but he would linger. It would always be at a moment where I was trying to strap my toddler to his car seat and I was rushing to get him to school. It would always take me about 10 minutes to get him to get the hint that I couldn't talk, and he would slowly walk away and just linger in our driveway. It eventually got to the point where I would watch to see if he had walked past our house on his morning walk before venturing outside. I really just hated the awkward conversation. He would always seem to round the corner just as I finished strapping my son in the car and I was getting in. I would wave and then jump in quickly and drive off. It just felt really off, like he was waiting for me. One of our neighbors across the street one night told me that she got a weird vibe from him as well. And again, he always lingered. She told me that he did similar things with her when they were outside as well. They were opting to hang in the backyard with the kids just to avoid it altogether. Now, I usually work from home, but one day I went into the office and I was then alerted by the Ring camera. This man was standing and looking in through our kitchen window, just peering, and I could hear our pit bull barking at him. When he saw our dog, he jumped back and I used the microphone to say, "Can I help you? What do you want?" He looked absolutely shocked and then scurried away. I called my husband and I told him to play the video. We both thought it was really creepy. Whenever we saw the family walking that evening, we decided to bring it up to his daughter. She spoke to her father and he claimed that it never happened. We then showed her the video on her phone and he said that he must have gotten lost. The daughter seemed pretty annoyed by him and the entire situation. So him being weird kinda calmed down a bit after that I could see that his daughter was really annoyed by his behavior, and as they were walking there was a really heated conversation. She later told me that he tends to be overly friendly and he really means no harm, but she talked to him and he would leave us alone. I asked if he had some kind of mental issue or maybe Alzheimer's since he was always getting lost. She told me no and that he had always acted like that and that she couldn't wait until his sister was ready for him to be sent up north to her. There were a few other neighbors that had also complained to her and the homeowners association as well. Well, about 2 months later, I dropped my son off to preschool. I get home and I have to rush in because I feel really sick. Usually I leave my car door open, but something told me to lock it as soon as I got out. I did so as I was rushing inside. I would also normally leave the door unlocked if I was just going for a quick throw-up session, but again, my instincts told me to lock the bottom and top lock. When I was in the bathroom, right by the front door, throwing up my life, I then hear a rattling at the front door. Someone is turning the lock back and forth. Of course, my ring chimes and I then look at it in between heaves. What do you know? It's the old man and he's trying to get into our home. I go over to the microphone and then say, "You're at the wrong house." To which he responds with,
Let me in, now. I want to tell you something.
Now, I kid you not, it was the best English sentence I had ever heard from someone who wasn't that good with English. I started to feel better pretty quickly and I was now on high alert. I responded with, "What do you want to tell me?" He looked right at the camera.
Let me in your house, now!
This is where I started to panic. He knew he was at the wrong house, but still he was continuing to try and break in. I respond, "Please get off my property. I don't feel comfortable with you here and I'm not letting you in my house." He then starts rattling at the door again really hard and tries to pull it open and then starts knocking on the bathroom window. This is where I get pissed. "Get the hell off my damn property right now. I'm not gonna let you in. If you don't get the hell out of here right now, I'm calling the cops." He then steps back, gives the camera the middle finger, and scurries off. He disappears and I run upstairs and see that he's simply walking back to his house. I let our pit bull out of our bedroom as he had been going crazy during this whole ordeal. I call my husband and he tells me to call the daughter and tell her what happened. I call her and I tell her what happened and she told me not to let him in, ever. She began to warn me that he's been very inappropriate and forceful with all of the women in her family, and she didn't want me to get hurt, especially being pregnant. She eventually comes over about an hour later and I show her the video. She's absolutely fuming over this and very apologetic, and she begs me not to call the cops. She promises me he'll be gone within the next day. The next day, he eventually flies out and his daughter told him that he's no longer welcome in her home. He now lives up north somewhere in Maryland with his other daughter and probably harassing other people as well. I honestly really don't know what would have happened if I didn't follow my instincts that day. I'm just really glad I'm okay. This story happened to me when I was in 3rd grade. I was about 8 years old at the time. My regular babysitter was ill, so my mom asked one of our neighbors who had kids and babysit a lot of the neighborhood kids if she would watch my brother and I for a few hours. We were having so much fun at Brandy's house when my mom came to pick us up. I asked if I could stay a little bit longer and finish Madagascar, as we had just started watching it. She said that it was fine, but I was to walk straight home right after. It was like maybe half a block, so not that far at all. So as the movie finishes, Brandy said that I needed to get home really fast because it was dark out. As I'm walking home, this other neighbor, Dennis, is just standing outside in his front yard. Now, I had seen Dennis around the neighborhood because his wife was very unforgettable looking. They have a daughter that was like maybe 4-ish at the time, so I didn't ever play with her or know her family outside of seeing them around the neighborhood. Dennis starts calling out to me, saying,
Hey, what are you doing?
"I'm just going to my parents."
Do you want to come inside for a little bit?
"No, that's okay. My mom told me to come straight home."
Ah, come on. I'm sure she wouldn't mind.
No thanks."
Come on. I have a daughter who would absolutely love to play with you. We can even make snacks.
At this point, I was just like, red flag, abort mission, and I started booking it home really fast. Then he starts following me. Not quickly, just kind of walking like Michael Myers. It was creepy. Luckily, I eventually made it home, and once he saw that I was approaching my house with my porch light on, he completely backed off. I'd like to mention that behind our houses was a giant wooded area with paths that led to a nearby lake. So, I mean, this dude could have caught me and dragged me into the woods or something. I try not to think like that, but like, what other motives could he have had, you know? Fast forward until I'm in high school and working at a restaurant in town. I see creepy Dennis and his wife all the time. As it turns out, they were secret shoppers at our restaurant. I don't think he really recognized me working there though. Anyways, I know this isn't your typical horror story of someone getting dragged into the woods, but still, as a child, this was a very creepy experience to go through. If you're a young child walking home alone, always watch your surroundings. You just never know. So, about a year ago, my apartment complex decided that they wanted to renovate my unit, so I had to move out at the end of my lease. I live in Denver and my rent is pretty ridiculous here, so I started worrying about finding something affordable in my neighborhood, which I really love. I posted on the Nextdoor app to see if anyone in my neighborhood knew of any affordable rentals in the area. I immediately got a message from someone named Joe who said that one of the condos in his complex was going to be up for rent pretty soon, and he knew the owner. He offered to get me in touch with the owner. I asked if he could send me pictures of the unit, and he asked if he could text me some pictures that his neighbor took because the chat function on the app is really slow. I now feel really stupid for doing this, but eventually gave him my phone number. I kid you not, I received a phone call from an unknown number within seconds. Now, I normally don't answer calls from unknown numbers, but I was expecting a call from a number that wasn't saved in my phone, so I answered it. I was completely bewildered when the person then said,
"Hi, it's Joe. How's your day going?"
Huh? It really took me by surprise and I didn't really know what to say. He started to just shoot the crap on the phone, talking about how he works nights and how tired he is and how he takes care of his daughter while his girlfriend works during the day. I finally interrupted and then said, "So, about the condo?" He pretty much completely disregarded that and then said,
"I really don't think that my girlfriend would appreciate me talking to you, but I don't have to tell her, right?"
I said that I have to go and then immediately hung up the phone. And as soon as I did, he then started texting me. It was really bizarre and quite alarming to me. I blocked his number and then moments later, he found me on Facebook and sent me a friend request. Now, I'm 32 years old, but it was really creepy to me, and I even called my parents to tell them about it and just how unnerved that it made me. And the worst part about it is that on Nextdoor, even if your exact address isn't listed, your complex is. So, I was pretty certain that I didn't have my address visible in my profile, but I checked and sure enough, my address and unit number were totally public. Unable to really contact me in any other way, he started messaging me again on Nextdoor, asking me if I wanted to go on a walk with him. You can't really block or report people on the app, so I just decided to delete it. So one night about a month or so later, I had a knock on my door at around 10 p.m. on a weeknight. I looked out my peephole but couldn't really get a good look. I saw that it was a man who slightly had his head down. Either way, I don't answer the door for anyone that I'm not expecting, especially not a random guy at 10 o'clock at night. Feeling panicked, I decided to call my neighbor across the hall. She's an older woman and we always look out for each other since we both live alone. I asked her if it looked like he was some kind of delivery guy at the wrong door. She opened her door to try and get a good look at the guy, and that spooked him because he literally ran away. I honestly have no idea if this was the Nextdoor guy or not, but my gut tells me that it was. This was a big wake-up call. I always felt that I practiced good online safety, but I didn't even know that my address was visible on Nextdoor. I'll never be that casual or lazy about privacy settings like that ever again. I'm 28 years old, but when I was about 5 years old, my mom and I lived in this duplex that was off a main road and kind of in a wooded area. We lived on one side and the other was a woman and her son. He was studying to be a teacher. My mother had me pretty young, so she was about 25 years old, and the guy was in his early 20s. He would often come and talk to my mom. My mother said that he would ask a lot of questions about me, and asked my mother if it would be alright for him to take me for walks in the woods. Of course, my mother always declined. My mother worked in the operating room at the local hospital and was on call a lot, so most of the weekends I stayed at my grandma's house. One night while I was at my grandma's house, my mom was home alone, sleeping. She woke in the middle of the night and said she doesn't remember if she heard something or felt someone in the room, but she woke up. She could see feet wearing socks that were sticking out from the end of her bed. She grabbed her bedside lamp and was about to hit the intruder when our neighbor then yelled her name and then said his name. He couldn't really explain why he was naked and only wearing socks, but he begged my mother not to tell his mother about it. My mother, of course, called the cops. She ended up going to court and making a victim impact statement against this guy because she was absolutely terrified that he'd become a teacher and be around children. She says that she's pretty sure that he was there for me that night and was so happy that I wasn't there. We ended up moving pretty much immediately after that happened. She just couldn't stay another night in that house. I'm just really glad that nothing happened to me or my mother. Who really knows what would have happened if he would have succeeded in whatever he was trying to do that night. This happened to me back when I was around 12 years old. I was going through some of my old cringy notebooks and journals with my girlfriend, and I found my old journal entry where I wrote about this day, and all the memories came flooding back to me. I used to live in what I thought was a really safe and secure private community. I wasn't allowed to just wander around too far from home without supervision, but because our neighborhood was a gated community, my parents would let me walk around within the gates anytime that I wanted, even if they weren't home. One day I was riding around the neighborhood after school when I saw a middle-aged woman crying on the floor of her porch with the front door wide open. I was pretty concerned and got off my bike to see what was wrong. She said that she was having problems with her husband and immediately asked me to come in so I could keep her company while she calmed down. My stranger danger sirens were completely going off, so I declined. She kept pushing me. Please, just for a moment. I just need someone to talk to. Now, I was raised to always respect elders and to be a good person, but I was also raised to know about stranger danger. So being a young naive kid, I actually felt pretty conflicted about whether I should go in or not. Ultimately, I declined repeatedly enough that she instead asked me to wait outside with her and then sit with her until she felt better. I agreed to this since I felt very safe in my own neighborhood. She asked me to wait on the porch for her while she walked into the house and visibly grabbed a couple of framed pictures from off the wall. She then sat down next to me inside the house while I was sitting on the porch just outside of her door. She then started showing me the pictures. One was of a kid older than me in the local high school football uniform, and the other of a man and the same kid. She went on to tell me these stories about how she met him and how they spent their honeymoon in Hawaii and how her kid was so good at football, one of the best on his team. She was very worried that if her and her husband got a divorce, she wouldn't be able to see her kid anymore. And then she started bawling again, this time onto my shoulder. This actually caused me to let my guard down quite a bit. For some reason, once I knew she had a kid, I felt a bit more comfortable around her. She was talking for a while though, and I was beginning to start to feel a little awkward as she was on and off crying on my shoulder, and I didn't know how to react in the situation. What the heck did I get myself into? I kept thinking to myself as I nodded my head pretending to listen. I was more concerned about finding a good excuse to tell her I had to go home. She kept calling me such a young nice boy and telling me, "You have no idea how important it is for you to spend your time with me," which made me feel a little bad about just leaving her. She kept telling me that she wanted to reward me and make me some dinner if I just came in, which I continued to decline. Finally, I told her I had to go, and she asked me if I knew anything about how to turn on her cell phone, as she just got her first cell phone very recently. I told her I did and I could help her out before I left. She told me to wait yet again, and this time left for quite a while. I kept thinking I should just walk away, but part of me didn't want to be rude, especially since she lived right around the corner from my house and possibly even knew my parents. My anxiety levels would spike as I got closer and closer in my head to convincing myself to just stand up and walk away. Then it would just dissipate and I'd tell myself, no, I can't just leave. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she brought me her phone, which was an Android. I had only had an iPhone 3G at the time, and it was my first smartphone, so I was a little worried that I wouldn't know how it worked. I just held the power button down for a second and lo and behold, it booted right up. She asked me then if I knew how to check text messages. I found and opened up the Messages app and there was only one number not saved as a contact in the app. She then pointed to it and said, "That's him. That's my husband's number. Read me his text." I opened it up. She had received basically the same text over and over again, just multiple variations on hello and please respond. She angrily said to me, "Read them to me right now. I want to know what he said to me." I then tell her. They basically all just say hello with a question mark. She just reaffirmed in a stern voice, "Read them to me." I started reading them. Hello, hello, please respond. She just has her eyes closed and she's nodding sometimes, commenting with things along the lines of, "That jerk, he does miss me. Well, screw him. He had his chance." She then turned quickly from this crying, distraught woman who was worried about her husband leaving her into an angry and spiteful person who felt like she was in the right. There was a couple of times when I stopped reading and I would ask if she wanted me to stop, and she would just snap at me, "Keep reading." Then I would continue. I started to feel like her husband was a crazy person with this many messages. I must have scrolled and read dozens of messages almost identical, spanning back days. My heart was racing. I felt like I was involved in something I shouldn't be involved in. I really wanted to go home, but every time I stopped, she would get really angry and tell me to keep going. That's when I came across the very first message that wasn't hello. "Stop messaging me, you crazy woman. Leave me alone. I've reported you to the police and got a restraining order. If you come anywhere near my family, you will be arrested." My heart sank. That's when I realized all the messages I had been reading so far were being sent from her phone. I paused in shock, and she again snapped at me, "Keep reading." I told her I couldn't because it was getting very late and my parents had dinner for me. She again just said, "Why don't you just come in for dinner? I'll make you something. You can let them know later you were helping your neighbor. They won't be mad, I promise." Only this time she was a mixture of angry and desperate. I told her they would be worried and wonder why I was gone for so long. She pleaded a couple more times for me to not leave her, and she started crying as I stood up. Honestly, I felt really bad about it at the time. I rode my bike home as quickly as I could. My parents had just gotten home from work a little while ago and asked me where I was. I didn't tell them the truth because honestly I was a little worried that they wouldn't let me hang around the neighborhood when they weren't home anymore. A few days later I came home and there were 3 police cars out in front of her house. My heart sank. I asked my parents later that night if they knew what had happened. My dad just said, "Oh, there was just a break-in or something." I later asked one of my neighbors to see if I could get some more information about what happened. Apparently one of my neighbors fell in love with a homeless woman after inviting her in for a shower and a place to stay. He got her some new clothes and a phone and was trying to help her get a job. Turns out the reason she was homeless was because she suffered from mental illness.
It was more like a few loud taps close to one of the front windows. I paused and glanced around. From where I stood in the kitchen, I could see the front door and one of the front windows. All the lights on the ground floor were on, and with it being dark outside, all I could see in the windows was a reflection of the inside of my living room. I waited for a few moments, but when the sound didn't come again, I shrugged it off and continued concentrating on the stove. After maybe 5 minutes, long enough for me to forget about the sound, it repeated itself. This time from the front window at the far side of the house. "Mark?" I called out, thinking it might have been my brother. There was no response. I walked over to the front of the house and peered outside with my hands pressed to the side of my face, but I couldn't see anything. I turned as my brother came down the stairs. "Did you just hear something from around back?" he said. I held up a finger to indicate that we should pause and listen, and almost on cue, we heard footsteps calmly walking across the wooden floor of our wraparound porch, just outside the dining room wall. "There's someone out there," I said quietly, more angry than scared. It was at this point that we should have locked all the doors and called out the window that we were calling the cops, but I was a stupid, headstrong kid, and pissed off that someone was messing with us. I remember my brother asking if the person outside was trying to distract us, but I was already at the gun cabinet. I should point out that I was raised with guns, and I knew how to properly handle one. I pulled out the 9mm from the drawer and loaded it. "I'm going to scare him off," I told my brother. "Lock the front door behind me." Before I could even give him a chance to argue, I was marching to the door with the gun in my hands. I threw open the door and stepped out into the porch. My brother then flicked on the outside lights, and right there, about 8 feet in front of me, was a sickly thin guy wearing a hoodie with light blue eyes and a soul patch on his chin. He had been in the process of stepping onto the porch, but the moment he saw me, he spun around and ran like a bat out of hell. I took off running a few yards after him, then stopped, pointed my gun in the air, and fired off a shot. "That's right, fuck off!" I cried out. I waited until he disappeared into the trees before turning around to face the house. I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say that for a few moments my heart stopped. I felt that momentary wave of ice water through my veins, and the painful thudding of my heart in my chest as it tried to correct its rhythm. There was at least 8 other people standing around my porch, and a handful more scattered around the yard. They were mostly men, but there was also at least 2 women, all dressed in dark jackets and hoodies, looking mostly like they were in their early 20s. None of them said anything. Instead, they all just stared at me, their hands mostly in their pockets, and I couldn't tell if any of them had weapons. Then they all just scattered. Some jogged away, but most of them just walked off in different directions out into the woods. I legitimately forgot for a handful of seconds that I was holding a gun, until I raised my hands to my face and felt its weight. I sprinted back to the front door and pounded on it until my brother let me back in. I had no idea what to tell him. I had just fired a gun up into the air, and none of them had cried out or made any sound whatsoever. Had they been drunk or something and were trying to pull a prank, they would have said something. They would have been like, "Whoa, sorry man, wrong house, put down the gun." But all they did was just look at me, like I had just ruined their surprise attack, and more disappointed than scared, they all just wandered off. I had no idea what to make of it. My brother turned on all the lights in the house and called the cops, who to their credit arrived within 10 minutes and swept the perimeter. There were footprints everywhere, and they asked my brother and I numerous times if we had just had a party. I kept telling them a dozen or more people had just been loitering around our house in the darkness, but the cops didn't seem to take it that seriously. They asked if the strangers had threatened us, and I had to admit that they didn't in any direct way. They confiscated the handgun after I told them that I fired off a round, but they eventually returned it. I have no idea to this day what those people were doing that night outside of our house. My brother suspects that they were part of some kind of cult, and maybe have been setting up to perform some kind of ritual, and maybe that we were set to be human sacrifices. I thought it more likely they intended to break in and rob us, but saw the gun and bailed. That doesn't explain the silence though. None of them uttered so much as a sound as they looked at me and just, as if instructed by some signal, scattered all at once. I've read that during alleged UFO sightings, people can become hypnotized by lights that appear above them, and they wake up hours later in entirely new locations having no idea what happened or how they got there. I can't dismiss that kind of possibility. They all seem to be hypnotized. That group of people has never returned, and I haven't even caught a glimpse of anyone I recognized from that night in town. We bought a dog not long after.
I remember walking out of Walmart with a cart full of gardening supplies a few years back. My mom had sprained her wrist and needed stuff picked up for the start of spring, so it was down to me to go grab some stuff for her. I didn't want to seem all confrontational or whatever, so I smiled and said, "Hey," and just carried on loading all the stuff into my trunk. Next thing I hear is someone saying, "Was it you?" I turn again, And it's the same guy, smiling back at me, having asked me that question. I'm like, was what me? And the guy responds like, you know. I sort of chuckle, thinking it was an honest mistake on the guy's part, thinking I was just someone else or whatever, so I tell him I don't know what he's talking about, then just carry on loading the stuff into my trunk. That's when I hear him walking towards me from his footsteps, so I turn around, hoping things aren't about to get confrontational. But those hopes were totally dashed when I saw the look on his face. He looked livid, and as I'm getting ready for the unfortunate event of having to fight a total stranger for no reason, the guy starts screaming at me. Don't pretend you don't know. You got me transferred. It's because of you I got transferred. He said a bunch of other stuff that might have you censoring this post, so I won't repeat it, but trust me when I say it was language that would have made a stevedore blush. I remember one of the scariest things being how he was still sort of smiling as he started shouting about being transferred. And then as he carried on screaming at me, he went bright red in the face, got this look about him like he was about to murder me, and he actually started spitting as he was screaming due to how out of control he was getting. I'm telling him to calm down, that there's been some kind of mistake, and that's all without even asking what he meant by got me transferred. But then every time I try to reason with the guy, he almost takes it like I'm trying to gaslight him or whatever, and it just makes him angrier. I don't even know how he managed to conceal it on him, but he pulled out this extendable baton from somewhere and whips it open right in front of me before charging at me. I just reacted, running around my car and screaming for other people in the parking lot to call 911. That was the other scary thing, how most people just stood and watched with their mouths open instead of either calling someone or actually getting involved to help. Then the other really scary thing, the guy's screams as he chased me, they went from actual words to just this wild psychobabble. Just stuff that barely made sense and only had an actual understandable word every 3 or 4 screams. He was completely manic, and it really didn't hit me at the time, but I later found out that he was suffering from a complete mental break. He was way faster than me too, so if it wasn't for me being able to duck and dodge around parked cars, he would have caught up with the guy chasing me. But this psycho kid swung at him a few times with his baton, and then the guy was forced to back off and try to tackle him when he had his back turned, which obviously wasn't easy because the kid was in this Super Saiyan manic state. Every time he got close, the kid just clocked him, turned, and started swinging. But then that gave me a window to put some more distance between us. The guy might have actually saved my life in that way. Anyway, the cops showed up after what seemed like way too long, but when they tried tasing the guy, it just had absolutely no effect on Days, but he kept on running from the scenes of the calls and getting away before they could actually take him into custody. I don't feel any ill will towards him, and I hope he got the help that he needed. But I'm not kidding when I say he legit could have killed me that day. Easily the scariest thing that's ever happened to me at Walmart. Last January, I was working as an associate at the Walmart over in Lake Charles. I was working second shift, so that's 1 p.m. to 10 p.m., and it was about 7 p.m. when people started to notice some kind of drama going off in the parking lot. The greeter noticed it first and was actually getting ready to have someone call the cops, but the whole thing seemed to die down, and then, from what I heard, things sort of just chilled out. I asked a coworker if anything juicy had happened, and she said no, but that the drama was between 2 groups of teenage girls and that one of the groups had walked into the store. They weren't being loud or obnoxious or anything, not at first anyway. They were just walking up and down the aisles talking among themselves, and one of the girls seemed to be making a video of them just hanging out. I remember hearing one of the girls saying something like, "Man, I need my taser back." But I just put that down to them talking smack after almost getting into a fight or something. The other thing I know is that loss prevention was watching them after one of them seemed to take something out of the kitchen utensils section, but they were just keeping their distance and observing until they tried to make an exit for the store. This is actually super relevant to what happened later on too, so keep it in mind. Anyways, I went back to what I was doing. Then the next thing I know, there's all kinds of screaming coming from near the front section of the store. I walked around to see what was going on, and that's when I see a group of girls in the doorway, shouting at the group that was inside. They were all saying all this stuff like, "Where y'all at? Come out." They knew the other group had walked inside the Walmart and were obviously trying to find them. The greeter was trying to get them to calm down or leave, saying they could either stop making a scene or he was going to call the cops, but neither group was paying him any mind. Then, one of the girls in the doorway group starts saying something threatening, and the other is all like, "I'm about to come out as soon as my sister gets here." But the other girl didn't want to wait for that. She just walks inside the store and marches straight over to this girl with dyed blonde hair. I'm like, snap. This is about to go off right here. And honestly, just like that, the two girls start throwing hands at one another in that typical girl fight way, just flailing their hands at one another. Then the girl with blonde hair, she reaches for something in her pants, and although I didn't see it clearly, she swings at the other girl's chest, and it looks a lot like she just punched her. But then as soon as the hit connected, the blonde girl, backed up, then ran off while the other girl just sort of staggered back, then looked down at her chest. I didn't see the blood, not right away, I just heard the screams. What I did see was the girl who had been hit stagger a few steps, then just collapse on the floor. Then when her friends dropped down and rolled her over, that's when I saw the blood on the floor. The EMTs were called, the girl was taken away in an ambulance, and we were all basically tasked with comforting the girl's friends as they were absolutely all shooken up that they just watched their girl get stabbed. Then, about 9 p.m., because we had to empty the store out so the cops could do their thing, I was told I could finish early so I could go home and try and get the whole thing out of my head. But then a half hour after I walked through the front door of my parents' place, I get an Instagram DM from one of the younger coworkers that I was tight with. They asked something like, "You were working second shift tonight, right?" And I respond, "Yeah, some messed up stuff happened." Then the next thing they send me is this long link that had Facebook in there somewhere. I figured it'd just be a sharing of a news story about the whole stabbing thing, but when I opened up the link, it opens up one of those Facebook Live videos, and instantly I knew what I was watching. I knew what I was watching because, 1, I recognized one of the girls from the stabbing at work, and 2, they're saying things like, "That was too much," and "If she killed her, she killed her," and then shrugging it off as if though it was her fault for coming at them and her friend was just defending herself. And then it got way worse. They were literally bragging how they killed someone, and they knew they killed someone too. I just thought the girl would be taken to the ER or something, but they knew she'd stabbed her in the heart because she aimed to stab her in the heart. We didn't find out until the next day that the girl who got stabbed had died on the way to the hospital. The most effed up thing though, none of those girls looked older than my little sister, who was a high school freshman at the time. Some of them barely looked like they'd gone through puberty yet. These were literally kids, literally effing children, and they just killed somebody and were proud of it. I think maybe it was just that they were trying to hide how scared they were, or trying to establish the whole self-defense thing before the cops came looking for them. But my God, seeing that kind of savagery coming out of a kid made my heart break for humanity a little. Those girls had ruined their lives with one little fight, and even worse, they'd literally ended another girl's. Taken her away from her family, friends, all she had going for her in life. All because of one stupid fight. I used to work the late shift at a Walmart here in Jacksonville, and every night after finishing at 1 in the morning, I'd walk to the exact same bus stop to call an Uber. Now, this whole story would never have happened if my dumb self didn't just get picked up from work. But I always like having a smoke as soon as I finished, and it wasn't the kind of thing that management would have taken kindly to, me smoking right outside of the Walmart. It was the arrested and fired kind of smoke, so I used to walk to the bus stop. Anyway, this one night I'm sitting there, smoking away, and the Uber is maybe only 3 or 4 minutes away. Seconds later, when I see the dude in the distance walking towards the bus stop, I immediately started getting bad vibes. Getting bad vibes from people when I was smoking up was hardly anything out of the ordinary, but I still figured that I'd keep an eye on him as he walked past, just in case he tried anything funny. He walks past me, but only by a few feet, and then he stops and leans against the bus stand like he's waiting for the bus with me. Now, I know well that there's no bus coming, so why is he just standing like there and getting closer and closer? And as much as I'm trying not to make eye contact with the guy, I can see him looking over at me every so often, like he's sizing me up or something. I'm feeling pretty thankful by the time my Uber rounds a corner and I start to see its headlights. But as it pulls up, I actually think that maybe my paranoia might be starting to get the better of me, and maybe it's just me being the judgmental one instead of the guy actually posing any kind of threat. Then literally, as I open the door to the Uber, the guy says, "You lucky kid." I look back, and he has this grin on his face that literally made my skin crawl. That's when I realized he did actually have something in mind for me. I don't know what it was, whether or not he planned on robbing me or just beating me up or whatever it was. I just know it wasn't good, and I thank Christ that my Uber showed up when it did.
This occurred several years ago. I used to shop at Walmart's quite frequently. They really sold everything I needed and were all over the place, so it was always my first store to go to. At one point, I had to go out of town for a work conference. It lasted about a week and was about a 10-hour drive away. After it was over, I was driving back. I was on the way home about halfway, and it got pretty late at night. I was prepared to drive through the night, but my car got low on gas, so I stopped at the next exit and filled it up. I was pretty hungry, but noticed that the convenience store of the gas station was closed. This town was really small and didn't seem to have much, but they did have a Walmart that was across the street. This Walmart was one of the strangest ones I had ever seen. It just wasn't the typical kind of Walmart building that they usually are in. The building seemed smaller, and more as if it had taken over a building of a previous store that had been there. The parking lot was quiet, only a couple of cars, so I looked it up on Google Maps, and it said sure enough it was open. This seemed kind of surprising to me because it was around midnight, but I pulled my car into the parking lot and went inside. As I slowly walked in, I didn't really know what I was looking for, but I guess just some type of food. As I walked around inside, I didn't notice anybody else. The inside of the Walmart looked for the most part like a regular Walmart, but at the same time, a lot different. It was much smaller inside and arranged differently than most of the ones I had been in. Still, not a big deal though, and I tried to find something I could snack on. As I walked around, I didn't see anybody else in the store at all. It seemed a little bit odd to not even see a worker, but then again it was midnight in a small town that I had never been in before. I had made it to the back aisle and was looking around when I heard the noise of someone walking. They entered the aisle from the far side from where I was in, and I noticed it was someone wearing one of those horse face masks that covers a person's whole head. I looked and it startled me at first, but then I chuckled. I guess it was some guy pranking people late at night. He stood there looking at me. Then he walked away. I told him it was very funny. I finally found a couple of things and picked them up. Then I headed to the front of the store. As I did, I noticed another person walking by, also wearing a horse mask. I thought maybe it had to be the guy's friend and they were both in on the joke. I once again smiled and kept walking. I used the self-checkout and paid for my things, all while not seeing a single employee. As I was almost done, I saw another 2 people emerge from behind one of the check lanes. They were both wearing horse masks as well. By that time, I got a rush of fear run through my body. I didn't know what was going on, but it didn't really seem like a joke to me anymore. I looked back and saw the other 2 people in horse masks staring at me from the back near the aisles. I tried to not let them see the fear that I had. I calmly got my receipt and walked away and out the doors. I walked all the way back to my car, hoping that I wouldn't hear the footsteps of anyone leaving behind me, and to my surprise, I didn't. But when I got to my car, I realized there was a new car that was parked next to mine. I tried to ignore it as best as I could, and got to my car, unlocked it, and quickly got inside. As I did, I glanced over to the car parked next to mine. At first, it looked like it was empty, but then I saw a horse mask pop up in the driver's seat. I just about had a heart attack in that moment. I slammed my foot on the gas and left that city back to the freeway and on my way home. I got home the next day and still wonder what was going on there. Last summer, I worked at a Walmart, mostly stocking shelves late at night. It was pretty easy and was really the first real job that I had. One night, I happened to be working at around 11 o'clock p.m. We were still open at that time, but we would rarely get many customers then because we closed at midnight. I was in an aisle where we sold pet supplies at the very back end of the store, just stocking a shelf. I heard somebody walking close by and then saw a man enter the aisle and start to approach me. I really didn't like when customers would ask me questions, but I would always do my best to answer them. He came closer to me, and when he did, I noticed that some of his clothes were ripped, and he seemed a little bit off. He said to me that he had a question for me. Then he began to ask something, but never really got to the question. He stopped himself and slowly said to me that he didn't like me. His face changed to an angry look. I had no idea what to do, but I figured this man had to be on some sort of drugs. He slowly walked behind the aisle we were in. I just shook my head and went back to work, but I could tell that the man was just standing there, barely around the corner. As I took products out of boxes and placed them on the shelves, I noticed out of the corner of my eye the man stick his head around the corner for a second and then go back. He still had a very angry look on his face. I did my best to ignore him and figured that he would walk away soon enough. About 5 minutes passed by, and as far as I knew, he was still there. Then out of nowhere, several items came flying off the shelf near me as if they had been pushed from the other side. Now this annoyed me. I said in a firm voice to the man that he should just get whatever he came here to get and leave. What he said in response was that he was going to get me, and then he called for me to come around the corner to the other side. I ignored it and started to pick up the items that fell. He called out a couple of more times for me to come out, but I just ignored him once again. About a minute later, I heard the sound of more people in the aisle next to mine. It sounded like 4 or 5 men were suddenly in the aisle. I decided to walk over and look, and saw several police officers start to take the man away. One of the officers walked over to me, and I asked him what happened. He told me that that man had assaulted somebody in a nearby restaurant a few blocks away in a seemingly random attack and then fled. He was found at the Walmart. It seemed like he was going for me next. I had a job a few years ago that was pretty tough. I worked some insanely long days and got home very late at night sometimes. One night I was working late, and I left work so sleepy that I could barely stay awake. I began driving home, and after about 10 minutes I knew I wouldn't make it all the way back before falling asleep. I pulled into the next exit where there was a 24-hour Walmart that I knew of. It was sometime after 2 in the morning when I got there. My goal was to just walk around a little bit to wake up, and maybe buy an energy drink or something with caffeine in it. I got inside the store and began to walk around. I only saw a few customers at the front end of the store with some employees, but other than that it seemed almost completely empty. I was walking around the back end of the store for a little bit, slowly starting to feel more awake, when I noticed someone walking behind me. They were walking behind me at an extremely close distance that was very uncomfortable. I stopped and looked behind me. There was a man that was no more than 5 feet away. He stopped as well and stared at me with a blank look on his face for a second. He was about 6 feet tall, wearing a brown suit jacket with a brown turtleneck. He then turned and walked away into a nearby aisle. I continued to walk around the store, but it wasn't long until the man was back again. This time, as soon as he got close, I turned to him and said, "Can I help you?" He once again just changed directions and walked away. I decided it would be best for me to just leave at that point. I went and got an energy drink and checked out. I was feeling more awake now though, and also a little bit creeped out by the man. I left the store and walked back to my car. Something about the way the man was staring at me just kind of gave me the creeps. Luckily for me, I was way more awake now.
Job. I thought it would be so cool. Like that episode of SpongeBob with the hash-slinging slasher or something. It was nothing like that at all. In fact, it got plain old repetitive after a while. I'm a male nurse and I had been working in a hospital nearby. It was a long commute and extremely unbearable. Once I finished my contract with the hospital, which was about a year, I decided to apply for another job. One that was a little less stressful and disorganized than the hospital. I got a job at a child psychiatric unit. Working with children with mental illnesses seemed like a cool job. Maybe cool isn't the right word, but meaningful. The hospital left me with this feeling of trying to save people who were going to die anyway. But with these kids, I could make a real difference that might turn their life around or find a way to let them cope with whatever is wrong with them. I was all around excited about it. The pay was even higher, which had me really excited too. The only problem was that the only shift available was the night shift. The hiring manager told me that there might be a day shift position available within a couple of months, and I would be the first one to get consideration if it opened. But that was about it. So there I was helping kids, at night. The only issue with that is that they were all asleep for the most part. The only time I got to do anything was when one of them woke up or started misbehaving. This very quickly became the most boring job I had ever worked in my life. About a month went by, and something moderately frightening finally happened. It was a night like any other. I was sitting at my desk charting some stuff I had done with other kids earlier that night. I had heard a noise that I did not quite recognize at first. It sounded like some of the kids were wrestling or something. But on the bed, I got anxious, as I did not want to go in there and see mentally handicapped kids doing, you know. Call me cynical, but that's where my mind went immediately. But when I got in there, I saw something that I don't think I can ever unsee. I turned the light on to see one of the older kids who was trying to smother another one. The kid who was doing the smothering had no previous incidents of violent behavior. I didn't personally know these kids well enough because I didn't work during the day, but I knew their cases well enough that the kid doing the smothering had bipolar disorder. It was severe, but he had never had a violent outburst like this. It was just so unusual, but I immediately pulled him off the other kid, and then he started fighting me. He reached around his own head and punched me in the nose at a weird angle. This kid had to have been 11 or 12 years old, and I honestly was surprised at how much force he had behind his punch. He didn't break my nose or anything, but he bloodied it up. My adrenaline kicked in after that, and I was able to restrain him without a problem. I called for a nurse from another unit in the building to come over and help me. I felt like this took forever, but was probably only just a few minutes. The entire time I was waiting though, I couldn't help but look at this little kid who had nearly murdered another kid. When the nurse got over, we gave him some medication that would knock him out and sedate him and put him to sleep. I asked the other nurse, Carla, what I was supposed to do. She was there for a few years before me, and I assumed she would have a good answer. We just did everything you can do, kid. Violent outbursts don't get kids thrown out of here very often. I was a little shocked. I argued with her a little, but that was that. I tried talking to the kid that was being smothered, but he didn't really have a whole lot to say about it. He said that he didn't really know the other kid that well, but they never had any negative incidents up until this night. This was a few years back, and I will never forget how I almost watched that kid die. If I had just been there a few minutes later, he could have been dead right now. It wasn't long after that experience that I started looking for another job. I got one a few weeks later, and I did my best to explain the situation to my case manager. She didn't seem to understand or care, and that's not my problem anymore.
One day like any other, I was sitting in my room doing whatever when I got a notification from Instagram that I got a new follower. It seemed to be one of those random spam-like accounts. The username was Ty13053, and there were 5 pictures on the profile, all of different typical suburban houses. The profile had 2 followers, was following 3 people including me, and none of the pictures had any likes. Comments seemed to be disabled on all of the pictures. I didn't bother blocking or removing the account from my followers, as I had my profile set to public anyway at the time. A couple nights later, I got a notification that the random Ty13053 account liked my most recent picture. Just being curious, I click on the notification and then pull up the profile again. This time there was a new picture on the profile, and I instantly recognized it as a picture of my house. I DM'd the profile asking who it was, saying it was very funny. Of course, it had to be one of my friends messing with me. When the person running the account left my DMs on scene and didn't reply, I followed up with, "This is harassment and a threat," and that I would have the police follow up on this. I ran to my parents' room to wake them up, as it was past 12 at that point. I showed them the picture of our house, and said someone was messing with me who knew where we lived. They tried to rationalize, and said the same thing I thought, that it was someone from my school messing with me. My dad and I both went outside regardless to have a look around the property and on the street. It was a ghost town out there though, as it should be past 12 o'clock. We went back inside into our respective bedrooms. I wasn't actually going to pursue it with the police at that exact moment. It was obvious to me, at least in the moment, that someone who knew me was pranking me. I stayed up for a few more hours, and around the time I was about to go to bed, I got a DM from the account. It was an image, another image of my house. It was on the side this time. As I had the chat opened, he sent another, this time a picture of my window, with the glare from the TV in my room visible in the picture. I didn't dare get up and look out the window. Wouldn't you guess it, the next DM from the account was, "Look out your window." I turned off the TV to allow total darkness in the room. I didn't want to be seen by whoever was at my window. I quietly crawled off my bed onto the floor in the dark. As I was crawling on the carpet towards the door, a pounding on the window started. I don't want to say knocking, because these bangs on the glass sounded loud enough to shatter it. Inevitably, I turned, and of course, saw a person at the window. Facial features, though, impossible to make out. I got up and ran out of my room and to my parents' room once again. I pulled my dad out of the bed and led him to my room. He heard the end of the bangs on my window, but by the time we got to my room, the guy at the window was gone. The banging was all my dad needed to believe me and take this seriously, though. We called the cops that second and talked to the officers who came. They said the good news was since the person was contacting me through Instagram, they could track the person after putting a legal request into Instagram. So that same night, we followed the cop car to the nearest precinct, where we went through this long process. They took the account name and my details of the story, and literally the next day, we found out who it was. It was this kid named Luke who went to my high school. As much as I want to give the last name, that could lead to issues. Luke was a very, very weird kid that didn't talk to many people. He was just a very mean, unpleasant, and scary dude. Not scary like tough. Scary like some would even fear he'd do something crazy that would harm students or staff. I don't know why he targeted me. I never even spoke to the kid. But this really proved how dangerous he was. He hit my window so hard we found small cracks on it in the daylight. He was arrested and we got him for a harassment charge, an attempted breaking and entering charge, and I think a couple others.